Hello, welcome back to Storytime. I'm Sunny, and today we are doing part 3 of Heidi. This is our last stream for Heidi, and we may go a bit over because we have about 2/5 of the book left to go. So didn't quite figure out the good stopping points there, but I don't mind going over because all I have, for the rest of the day planned is a chill game stream after that, and then I'm making pesto for me and my sister. Just wanted to state a quick disclaimer about this book and all of the books that I read because they are public domain. All the ones that I read since I'm putting them up on YouTube, they're over 100 years old. And what was deemed appropriate back then may not coincide with what is appropriate nowadays. Also, some of them, like Heidi, I didn't quite realize how much into the religion they went. And, I don't mind if people are religious, but I don't want people to think that I'm preaching at them because I'm not. I say that your religion is your own business, and that is fine. If you are, if you're not, it makes no difference to me. I just, like to have a nice chill story. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, we are at Chapter 17, Excursions Over the Mountains. The next morning, the doctor climbed up from Dorfley with Peter and the goats. At the hut, they found Heidi awaiting them with her 2 goats, all 3 as fresh and lively as the morning sun among the mountains. "Are you coming today?" said Peter, repeating the words with which he daily greeted her. "Of course I am, if the doctor is coming too," replied Heidi. "Hi, John. Good to see you here." Peter cast a sidelong glance at the doctor. The grandfather now came out with the dinner bag, and after bidding good day to the doctor, he went up to Peter and slung it over his neck. It was heavier than usual, for Almuncle had added some meat today, as he thought the doctor might like to have his lunch out of doors with the children. Peter gave a grin, for he felt sure there was something extra good in it. And so the ascent began. The goats, as usual, came thronging around Heidi, each trying to be nearest her, until at last she stood still and said, "Now you must go on in front and behave properly, and if not, keep on turning back and pushing and poking me, for I want to talk to the doctor." By degrees she managed to make her way out from among them and joined the doctor, who took her by the hand. Heidi had a great deal to say about the goats and their peculiarities, and about the flowers and the rocks and the birds, and so they clambered on and reached their resting place before they were aware. Peter had sent a good many unfriendly glances towards the doctor on the way up, which might have quite alarmed the latter if he had happened to notice them, which fortunately he did not. Heidi led her friends to her favorite spot where she was accustomed to sit and enjoy the beauty around her. The doctor followed her example and took his seat beside her on the warm grass. The great snowfields sparkled in the bright sunlight on the rocky peaks. A soft, light morning breeze blew deliciously across the mountain, gently stirring the bluebells that still remained of the summer wealth of flowers, their slender heads nodding cheerfully in the sunshine. Overhead, the great bird was flying round and round in wide circles. Heidi looked about her first at one thing, and then at another. Her eyes were alight with joy. She turned to her friend to see if he too were enjoying the beauty. The doctor had been sitting thoughtfully gazing around him. As he met her glad, bright eyes, "Yes, Heidi," he responded, "I see how lovely it is, but tell me, if one brings a sad heart up here, how may it be healed so that it can rejoice in all this beauty?" "But no one is sad up here, only in Frankfurt," exclaimed Heidi. The doctor smiled, and then, growing serious again, he continued, "But supposing one is not able to leave all the sadness behind at Frankfurt, can you tell me anything that will help them?" "Well, you do not know what more to do. When you do not know what more to do, you must tell everything to God," answered Heidi with decision. "Ah, "That is a good thought of yours, Heidi," said the doctor. "But if it is God himself who has sent the trouble, what can you say to him then?" Heidi sat pondering for a while. She was sure in her heart that God would help out of every trouble. Yes, Knockings, come on. Make up your mind, in my lap or off. Come on. She thought over her own experiences and then found her answer. "Then you must wait," she said, "and keep on saying to yourself, God certainly knows of some happiness for which he is going to bring out the trouble, only he must have patience and not run away." We must. "That is a beautiful faith, child, and be sure you hold fast to it," replied the doctor. "But can you understand, Heidi, that a man may sit here with such a shadow over his eyes that he cannot feel and enjoy the beauty around him, while the heart grows doubly sad, knowing how beautiful it could be? Can you understand that?" A pain shot through the child's young, happy heart. The shadow over the eyes brought to her remembrance the grandmother, who would never again be able to see the sunlight and the beauty up here. This was Heidi's great sorrow, which reawoke each time she thought about the darkness. "Yes, I can understand it. But I know this, that then one must say one of the grandmother's hymns, which brings the light back a little, and often make it so bright for her that she is quite happy again. Grandmother herself told me this." "Which hymns are they, Heidi?" asked the doctor. "I only know the one about the sun and the beautiful garden, and some of the verses of the long one, which are favorites of hers, and she always likes me to read them to her 2 or 3 times over," replied Heidi. "Well, say the verses to me, then. I should like to hear them too," said the doctor. Heidi collected her thoughts for a second or two, and began. "Let not your heart be troubled, nor fear your soul dismay. There is a wise defender, and he will be your stay. Where you have failed, he conquered. See how the foeman flies, and all your tribulation is turned to glad surprise. For it is, if for a while it seemeth his mercy is withdrawn, that he no longer careth for his wandering child forlorn, doubt not his great compassion, his love can never tire. To those who wait in patience, he gives their heart's desire." Suddenly she paused. She was not sure if the doctor was still listening. He was sitting motionless with his hand before his eyes. His thoughts had carried him back to a long past time. He saw himself as a little boy standing by his dear mother's chair. She had her arm round his neck and was saying the very verses to him that Heidi had just recited, words which he had not heard for years now. He could hear his mother's voice and see her loving eyes resting upon him, and as Heidi ceased, the old dear voice seemed to be saying other things to him, and the words he heard again must have carried him far, far away, for it was a long time before he stirred or took his hand from his eyes. When at last he roused himself, he met Heidi's eyes looking wonderingly at him. "Heidi," he said, taking the child's hand in his, "it was a beautiful hymn of yours." And there was a happier ring in his voice as he spoke. "We will come out here together another day, and you will let me hear it again." Peter, meanwhile, had been giving vent to his anger. It was now some days since Heidi had been out with him, and when at last she did come there, she sat the whole time beside the old gentleman, and Peter could not get a word with her. He got into a terrible temper, and at last went and stood some way back behind the doctor, where the latter could not see him, and doubling his fist made imaginary hits at the enemy. Presently he doubled both fists, and the longer Heidi stayed beside the gentleman, the more fiercely did he threaten with them. Meanwhile the sun had risen to the height which Peter knew pointed to the dinner hour. All of a sudden he called at the top of his voice, "It's dinner time!" Heidi started for the dinner bag so that the doctor might eat his where he sat, but he stopped her, telling her he was not at all hungry, and only cared for a glass of milk as he wanted to climb up a little higher. Then Heidi found that she was also not hungry and only wanted milk, and she should like, she said, to take the doctor up to the large moss-covered rock where Greenfinch had nearly jumped down and killed herself. So she ran and explained matters to Peter, telling him to go and get milk for the two. Peter seemed hardly to understand. "Who's going to eat what is in the bag, then?" he asked. "You can have it," she answered. "Only first make haste and get the milk." Peter had seldom performed any task more promptly, for he thought of the bag and its contents, which now belonged to him. As soon as the other two were sitting quietly drinking their milk, he opened it and quite trembled for joy at the sight of the meat, and he was just putting his hand in to draw it out when something seemed to hold him back. His conscience smote him at the remembrance of how he had stood with his doubled fist behind the doctor, who was giving up to him his whole good dinner. He felt as if he could not now enjoy it, but all at once he jumped up and ran back to the spot where he had stood before, and there held up his own hands as a sign that he had no longer any wish to use them as fists, and kept them up until he felt he had made amends for his past conduct. Then he rushed back and sat down to double enjoyment of a clear conscience and unusually satisfying meal. Heidi and the doctor climbed and talked for a long time, until the latter said it was time for him to be going back, and no doubt Heidi would like to go and be with her goats. But Heidi would not hear of this, as then the doctor would have to go the whole day down the mountain alone. She insisted on accompanying him as far as the grandfather's hut, or even a little further. She kept hold of her friend's hand all the time, and the whole way she entertained him with accounts of this thing and that. But at last the doctor insisted on her going back, so they bid each other good night, and the doctor continued his descent, turning now and again to look back, and each time he saw Heidi standing on the same spot and waving her hand to him. Even so in the old days had his own dear little daughter watched him when he went from home. It was a bright, sunny autumn month. The doctor came up to the hut every morning, and thence made excursions over the mountain. Almuncle accompanied him on some of his higher ascents. The doctor found great pleasure in his companion's conversation, and was astonished at his knowledge of the plants that grew on the mountain. He was well versed also in the ways of the animals, great and small, and had many amusing anecdotes to tell of these dwellers in caves and holes, and in the tops of the fir trees. And so the time passed pleasantly and quickly for the doctor, who seldom said good-bye to the old man at the end of the day without adding, "I never leave you, friend, without having learnt something new from you." On some of the very finest days, however, the doctor would wander out again with Heidi, and then the two would sit together as on the first day, and the child would repeat her hymns and tell the doctor things which she alone knew. Peter sat at a little distance from them, but he was now quite reconciled in spirit, and gave vent to no angry pantomime. September had drawn to its close, and one morning the doctor appeared, looking less cheerful than usual. It was his last day, he said, and he must return to Frankfurt, but he was grieved at having to say good-bye to the mountain, which had begun to feel quite like home to him. Almuncle, on his side, greatly regretted the departure of his guest, and Heidi had been accustomed for so long to see her good friend every day that she could hardly believe the time had suddenly come to separate. She walked part way down the mountain with him, still unable to grasp the idea that he was going for good. After some distance, the doctor stood still, and passing his hand over the child's curly head, said, "Now, Heidi, you must go back, and I must say good-bye. If only I could take you with me to Frankfurt and keep you there." The picture of Frankfurt rose before the child's eyes, its endless rows of houses, its hard streets, and even the vision of Miss Rottermeier and Tinette, and she answered hesitantly, "I would rather that you came back to us." "Yes, you are right, that would be better. Now goodbye, Heidi." The child put her hand in his and looked up at him. The kind eyes looking down on her had tears in them. Then the doctor tore himself away and quickly continued his descent. Heidi remained standing without moving. The friendly eyes with the tears in them had gone to her heart. All at once she burst into tears and started running as fast as she could after the departing figure, calling out in broken tones, "Doctor! Doctor!" He turned round and waited till the child had reached him. The tears were streaming down her face, and she sobbed out, "I will come to Frankfurt with you now at once, and I will stay with you as long as you like, only I must just run back and tell grandfather." The doctor laid his hand on her and tried to calm her excitement. "No, dear child," he said kindly. "Not now. You must stay for the present under the fir trees. You might get sick again, but if I am ever ill and alone, will you come then and stay with me? May I know that there would then be someone to look after me and care for me?" Yes, I will come the very day you send for me. And I love you nearly as much as grandfather," replied Heidi, who had not yet got over her distress. And so the doctor again bid her good-bye and started on his way, while Heidi remained looking after him and waving her hand as long as a speck of him could be seen. As the doctor turned for the last time and looked back at the waving Heidi and the sunny mountain, he said to himself, "It is good to be up there, good for body and soul, and a man might learn how to be happy once more." Chapter 18. A New Home for the Winter. Almunkel had kept his word and was not spending the winter in his old home. As soon as the first snow began to fall, he had shut up the hut and the outside buildings and gone down to Dorfli with Heidi and the goats. Near the church was a straggling, half-ruined building, which had once been the home of a distinguished soldier. It was rented to poor people who paid but a small sum, and when any part of the building fell, it was allowed to remain. As soon as the grandfather had made up his mind to spend the winter in Dorfli, he rented the old place and worked during the autumn to get it sound and tight. In the middle of October, he and Heidi took up their residence there. On approaching the house from the back, one first came into an open space with a wall on either side, of which one was half in ruins. Above this rose the arch of an old window thickly overgrown with ivy, which spread over the remains of a domed roof that had evidently been part of a chapel. A large hall came next, which lay open, without doors, to the square outside. Here also walls and roof only partially remained, and indeed what was left of the roof looked as if it might fall at any minute had it not been for two stout pillars that supported it. Almunkel had here put up a wooden partition and covered the floor with straw, for this was to be the goat's house. Endless passages led from this, through the rents of which the sky as well as the fields and the road outside could be seen at intervals, but at last one came to a stout oak door that led into a room that still stood intact. Here the walls and the dark wainscoting remained as good as ever, and in the corner was an immense stove reaching nearly to the ceiling, on the white tiles of which were painted large pictures in blue. These represented old castles surrounded with trees, and huntsmen riding out with their hounds, or else a quiet lake scene with broad oak trees and a man fishing. A seat ran all round the stove so that one could sit at one's ease and study the pictures. These attracted Heidi's attention at once, and she had no sooner arrived with her grandfather than she ran and seated herself and began to examine them. But when she had gradually worked herself round to the back, something else diverted her attention. In the large space between the stove and the wall, 4 planks had been put together, as if to make a large receptacle for supplies. For apples. Oh, my goodness. These were no apples, however, inside. Oh, goodness, I'm going to have to start that again. In the large space between the stove and the wall, 4 planks had been put together, as if to make a large receptacle for apples, but there were no apples, however, inside, but something Heidi had no difficulty in recognizing, for it was her own bed, with its hay mattress and sheets, and a sack for a coverlid, just as she had had up at the hut. Heidi clapped her hands for joy and exclaimed, "Oh, grandfather, this is my room! How nice! But where are you going to sleep?" "Your room must be near the stove, or you will freeze," he replied. "But you can come and see mine, too." Heidi got down and skipped across the large room until after her grandfather, who opened a door at the farther end leading into a smaller one, which was to be his bedroom. Then came another door. Heidi pushed it open and stood amazed, for here in an immense room stood like a kitchen, larger than anything of the kind that Heidi had seen before. There was still plenty of work for the grandfather before this room would be finished, for there were holes and cracks in the walls through which the wind whistled, and yet he had already nailed up so many new planks that it looked as if a lot of small cupboards had been set up round the room. He had, however, made the large old door safe with many screws and nails as a protection against the outside air, and this was very necessary, for just beyond was a mass of ruined buildings overgrown with tall weeds, which made a dwelling place for innumerable beetles and lizards. Heidi was very delighted with her new home, and by the morning after their arrival she knew every nook and corner so thoroughly that she could take Peter over it and show him all that was to be seen. Indeed, she would not let him go until he had examined every single wonderful thing contained in it. Heidi slept soundly in her corner by the stove, but every morning when she first awoke, she still thought she was on the mountain, and that she must run outside at once to see if the fir trees were so quiet because their branches were weighing down with the thick snow. She had to look about her for some minutes before she felt quite sure where she was, and a certain sensation of trouble and oppression would come over her as she grew aware that she was not at home in the hut. But then she would hear her grandfather's voice outside attending to the goats, and these would give one or two loud bleats, as if calling to her to make haste and go to them. And then Heidi was happy again, for she knew she was still at home, and she would jump gladly out of bed and run out to the animals as quickly as she could. On the fourth morning, as soon as she saw her grandfather, she said, "I must go up to see grandmother today. She ought not to be alone so long." But grandfather would not agree to this. "Neither today nor tomorrow can you go," he said. "The mountain is covered fathom deep in snow, and the snow is still falling. The sturdy Peter can hardly get along. A little creature like you would seem to soon be smothered by it, and we should not be able to find you again. Wait a bit till it freezes, and then you will be able to walk over the hard snow." Heidi now went to school in Dorfli and eagerly sat to work to learn all that was taught her. She hardly ever saw Peter there, for as a rule he was absent. The teacher was an easy-going man who merely remarked now and then, "Peter's not turning up today again, it seems, but there is a lot of snow up on the mountain. I dare say he cannot get along." Peter, however, always seemed able to make his way through the snow in the evening when school was over, and he then generally paid Heidi a visit. At last, after some days, when Peter climbed out of his window one morning, the door was quite blocked by the snow outside. He was taken by surprise, for instead of sinking into the snow, he fell on the hard ground and went sliding some way down the mountainside like a sleigh before he could stop himself. He picked himself up and tested the hardness of the ground by stamping on it and trying with all his might to dig his heels into it, but even then he could not break off a single little splinter of ice. The arm was frozen hard as iron. This was just what Peter had been hoping for he knew that now Heidi would be able to come up to see him. He quickly got back into the home, swallowed the milk which his mother had ready for him, thrust a piece of bread in his pocket, and said, "I must be off to school," and in another minute was shooting down the mountain on his sled. He was like lightning, and when he reached Dorfli, which stood in the direct road to Mayenfeld, he made up his mind to go no further. So down he still went till he reached the level ground, where the sled came to a pause of its own accord some little way beyond Mayenfeld. He knew it was too late to get to school now, as lessons would already have begun, and it would take him a good hour to walk back to Dorfli. So he took his time about returning and reached Dorfli just as Heidi had gotten home from school and was sitting at dinner with her grandfather. Peter walked in, exclaiming as he stood still in the middle of the room, "She's got it now." "Got what?" asked the uncle. "Your words sound quite warlike, General." "Frost!" exclaimed Peter. "Oh, now I can go and see the grandmother," said Heidi joyfully, for she had understood. said Heidi joyfully, for she had understood Peter's words at once. "But why were you not at school, then? You could have come down on the sled," she added reproachfully, for it did not agree with Heidi's ideas of good behavior to stay away when it was possible to be there. "It carried me too far, and I was too late," Peter replied. "I call that being a deserter," said the uncle, "and deserters get their ears pulled, as you know." Peter gave a tug to his cap in alarm, for there was no one of whom he could stood in so much awe as Almuncle. "And an army leader like yourself ought to be doubly ashamed of running away," continued Almuncle. "What would you think of your goats if one went off this way and another that, and refused to follow and do what was good for them? What would you do then?" "I should beat them," said Peter promptly. "And if a boy behaved like these unruly goats, and he got a beating for it, what would you say then?" "Serves him right," was the answer. "Good. Then understand this. Next time you let your sled carry you past the school when you ought to be inside your lessons, come on to me afterwards and receive what you deserve." Peter understood the drift of the old man's questions, and that he was the boy who behaved like the unruly goats, and he looked somewhat fearfully towards the corner to see if there happened to be a stick around. But now the grandfather suddenly said in a cheerful voice, "Come and sit down and have something, and afterwards Heidi shall go up with you. Bring her back this evening, and you will find supper waiting for you here." This unexpected turn of conversation set Peter grinning all over with delight. He obeyed without hesitation and took his seat beside Heidi, but the child could not eat in her excitement at the thought of going to see grandmother. She ran to the cupboard and brought out the warm cloak Clara had sent her, with this on and the hood drawn over her head. She was all ready for her journey. She stood waiting beside Peter, and as soon as his last mouthful had disappeared, she said, "Come along now." As the two walked together, Heidi had much to tell Peter of her two goats that had been so unhappy the first day in their new stall that they would not eat anything but stood hanging their heads, not even rousing themselves to bleat. And when she asked her grandfather the reason for it, he told her that it was the same with the goats as with her in Frankfurt, for it was the first time in their lives that they had come down from the mountains. "And you don't know what that is, Peter, unless you have felt it yourself," added Heidi. When they reached their destination, they found Brigitte sitting alone knitting, for the grandmother was not very well and had to stay in bed on account of the cold. Heidi had never before missed the old figure in her place in the corner, and she quickly ran into the next room. There lay grandmother on her little poorly covered bed, wrapped up in her warm gray shawl. "Thank God!" she exclaimed as Heidi came running in. The poor old woman had had a secret fear at heart all through the autumn, especially if Heidi was absent for any length of time, for Peter had told her of a strange gentleman who had come from Frankfurt, and who had gone about with them, and always talked to Heidi, and she had felt sure that he had come to take her away again. But even when she heard he had gone off alone, she still had an idea that a messenger would be sent over from Frankfurt and take the child. Heidi went up to the side of the bed and said, "Are you very ill, grandmother?" "No, no, child," answered the old woman reassuringly, passing her hand lovingly over the child's head. "It's only the frost that has got into my bones a bit." Shall you be quite well then directly it turns warm again?" "Yes, God willing, or even before that, for I want to get back to my spinning. I thought perhaps I should do a little today, but tomorrow I am sure to be all right again." Heidi noticed that the grandmother was wrapped up in her nice shawl, and exclaimed, "In Frankfurt, everybody puts on a shawl to go out walking. Did you think it was to be worn in bed, grandmother?" "I put it on, dear child, to keep myself from freezing, and I am so pleased with it, for my bedclothes are not very thick," she answered. "But, grandmother," continued Heidi, "your bed is not right because it goes downhill at your head instead of uphill." "I know it, child, I can feel it," said the grandmother, and she put up her hand to the thin, flat pillow, which was little more than a board under her head, to make herself more comfortable. "The pillow was never very thick, and I have lain on it now for so many years that it has grown quite flat." "Oh, if only I had asked Clara to let me take away my Frankfurt bed," said Heidi. "I had 3 large pillows, one above the other, so that I could hardly sleep, and I used to slip down to try and find a flat place, and then I had to pull myself up again because it was proper to sleep there like that." "Could you sleep like that, Grandmother?" "Oh, yes, the pillows keep one warm, and it is easier to breathe when the head is high," answered the grandmother. "But we will not talk about that, for I have so much that is, For I have so much that other old sick people are without, for which I thank God. There's the nice bread I get every day, and this warm wrap, and your visits, Heidi. Will you read me something today?" The grandmother lay with folded hand. Heidi ran into the next room to get the hymn book. Then she picked out the favorite hymns one after another, for she knew them all by heart now, and was as pleased as the grandmother to hear them again after so many days. The grandmother lay with folded hands, while a smile of peace stole over the warm, troubled face, like one of whom good news has been brought. One to whom. Suddenly Heidi paused. "Grandmother, are you feeling quite well again already?" "Yes, child. I have grown better while listening to you. Read it to the end." The child read on, and when she came to the last words, "As the eyes grow dim and darkness closes round, the soul grows clearer. See the goal to which it travels, gladly feels its home is nearer," the grandmother repeated them once or twice to herself, with a look of happy expectation on her face. And Heidi took equal pleasure in them, for the picture of the beautiful sunny day of her return home rose before her, and she exclaimed joyfully, "Grandmother, I know exactly what it is like to go home." A little later, Heidi said, "It is growing dark and I must go, and I am so glad to think that you are quite well again." She ran into the next room and bid Peter come quickly, for it had now grown quite dark. But when they got outside, they found the moon shining down on the white snow and everything as clear as in the daylight. Peter got his sleigh, put Heidi on the back, and he himself sitting in the front to guide, and down the mountain they shot like 2 birds darting through the air. When Heidi was lying that night on her high bed of hay, she thought of the grandmother on her low pillow, and of all she had said about the light and comfort that awoke in her when she heard the hymns, and she thought, if I could read to her every day, then I should go on making her better. But she knew that it would be a week, if not 2, before she would be able to go up the mountain again. This was a thought of great trouble to Heidi, and she tried hard to think of some way which would enable the grandmother to hear the words that she loved, that so delighted with it. Which would enable the grandmother to hear the words she loved every day. Suddenly an idea struck her, and she was so delighted with it that she could hardly bear to wait for morning, so eager was she to begin carrying out her plan. All at once she sat upright in her bed, for she had been so busy with her thoughts that she had forgotten to say her prayers, and she never now finished her day without saying them. When she had prayed with all her heart for herself, her grandfather and grandmother, she lay back down on the warm, soft hay and slept soundly and peacefully till the morning broke. Chapter 19. Heidi teaches obstinate Peter. Peter arrived punctually at school the following day. He had brought his dinner with him, for all the children who lived at a distance regularly seated themselves at midday on the tables, and resting their feet firmly on the benches, spread out their meal on their knees, and so ate their dinner, while those living in Dorfley went home for theirs. Till 1 o'clock they might all do as they liked, and then school began again. As soon as Peter finished his lessons, he went over to Uncle's to see Heidi. When he walked into the large room at Uncle's today, Heidi immediately rushed forward and took hold of him and said, "I've thought of something, Peter." "What is it?" he asked. "You must learn to read," she informed him. "I have learnt," was the answer. Yes, but I mean that you can really make use of it," continued Heidi eagerly.
"I never shall," was the prompt reply. "Nobody believes that until that you cannot learn, nor I neither now," said Heidi in a very decided tone of voice. "Grandmamma in Frankfurt said long ago that it was not true, and she told me not to believe you." Peter looked rather taken aback at this piece of intelligence. "I will soon teach you to read, for I know how," continued Heidi. "You must learn at once, and then you can read one or two hymns every day to grandmother." "Oh, I don't care about that," he grumbled in reply. This hard-hearted way of refusing to agree to what was kind and right, and to what Heidi had so much at heart, aroused her anger. With flashing eyes she stood facing the boy and said threateningly, "If you won't learn as I want you to, I will tell you what will happen. You know your mother has often spoke of sending you to Frankfurt, that you may learn a lot of things, and I know where the boys there have to go to school. Clara pointed out the great house to me when we were driving together, and they don't only go when they are boys, but have more lessons still when they are grown men. I have seen them myself, and you mustn't think they have only one kind teacher like we have. There are ever so many of them, like in the school at the same time, and they are all dressed in black, and if they were going to church, as if they were going to church, and have black hats on their heads as high as that." And Heidi held out her hand to show their height from the floor. Peter felt a cold shudder run down his back. "And you will have to go in among all those gentlemen," counted Heidi with increasing animation. "And when it comes to your turn, you won't be able to read and will make mistakes in your spelling. Then you will see how they'll make fun of you, even worse than Tinette, and you ought to have seen what she was like when she was scornful." "Well, I'll learn then," said Peter, half sorrowfully and half angry. Heidi was instantly mollified. "That's right. Then we'll begin at once," she said cheerfully. Among other presents, Clara had sent Heidi a book which the latter had decided would be just the thing for teaching Peter, as it was an ABC book with rhyming lines. So the two sat together at the table with their heads bent over the book and began the lesson. Peter was made to spell out the first sentence 2 or 3 times over, for Heidi wished him to get it correct and fluent. At last she said, "You don't seem able to get it right, but I will read it aloud to you once. Then, when you know what it ought to be, you will find it easier." And she read out, "ABC must be learned today, or the judge will call you up to pay." "I shan't go," said Peter obstinately. "Go where?" asked Heidi. "Before the judge," he answered. "Well, then make haste and learn these 3 letters. Then you won't have to go." Peter went at his task again and repeated the 3 letters so many times and with such determination that she said at last, "You must know those 3 now." Seeing what an effort the first 2 lines of verse had had upon him, she thought she would prepare the ground a little for the following lessons. "Wait, and I will read you some of the next sentences," she continued, "and then you will see what else there is to expect." And she began in a clear, slow voice. "D, E, F, G must run with ease, or something will follow that does not please. Should H, I, J, K be now forgot, disgrace is yours upon the spot. And when then LM must follow at once, or punished you'll be for a sorry dunce. If you knew what next awaited you, you'd haste to learn NOPQ. Now RST is quick about, or worse will follow, there's little doubt." Heidi paused, for Peter was so quiet that she looked to see what he was doing. These many secret threats and hints of dreadful punishment had so affected him that he sat as if petrified and stared at Heidi with horror-stricken eyes. Her kind heart was moved at once, and she said, wishing to reassure him, "You need not be afraid, Peter. Here, come to me every evening, and if you learn as you have today, or you will at least know your letters, and the other things won't come. But you must come regularly, not only now and then as you do to school. Even if it snows, it won't hurt you." He promised, and the lessons being finished for this day, he went now home. Peter obeyed Heidi's instructions punctually, and every evening went diligently to work to learn the letters, taking the sentences thoroughly to heart. The grandfather was frequently in the room smoking his pipe comfortably while the lessons were going on, and his face twitched occasionally as he was overtaken with a sudden fit of merriment. Peter was often invited to stay to supper after the great exertion he had gone through, which richly compensated him for the anguish of mind he had suffered with the sentence for the day. So the winter went by, and Peter really made progress with his letters, but he went through a terrible fight each day with the sentence. He got at last to you. Heidi read out, and if you put the U for V, you'll go where you would not like to be. Peter growled, "Yes, but I shan't go." But he was very diligent that day, as if under the impression that someone would seize him suddenly by the collar and drag him where he would rather not go. The next evening Heidi read, "If you falter at W, worst of all, look at the stick against the wall." Peter looked at the wall and said scornfully, "There isn't one." "Yes, but do you know what Grandfather has in his box?" asked Heidi. "A stick as thick as a stick almost as your arm. And if he took that out, you might say, look at the stick on the wall." Peter knew that stick, thick hazel stick, and immediately bent his head over the W and struggled to master it. Another day the lines ran, "Then comes the X for you to say, or be sure you'll get no food today." Peter looked towards the cupboard where the bread and cheese were kept, and said crossly, "I never said that I should forget the X. That's all right. If you don't forget it, we can go on to learn the next, and then you will only have one more," replied Heidi, anxious to encourage him. Peter did not quite understand, but when Heidi went on and read, "And should you make a stop at Y, they'll point at you and cry, 'Fie, fie!' All the gentlemen in Frankfurt, with tall black hats on their heads, and scorn and mockery in their faces, rose up before his mind's eye, and he threw himself with energy on that Y, not letting it go till at last he knew it so thoroughly that he could see what it was like, even if he shut his eyes. He arrived on the following day in a somewhat lofty frame of mind, for there was now only one letter to struggle over. And when Heidi began the lessons with reading aloud, "Make haste with Z, if you're too slow, off to the Hottentots you'll go," Peter remarked scornfully, "I dare say, when no one knows even where such people live." Yeah, that is what it says. "I assure you, Peter," replied Heidi, "Grandfather knows all about them. Wait a second, and I will run and ask him, for he is only over the way with the pastor." And she rose and ran to the door to put her words into action, but Peter cried out in a voice of agony, "Stop!" for he already saw himself being carried off by Almuncle and the pastor, and sent straight away to the Hottentots, since as yet he did not know his last letter. His cry of fear brought Heidi back. "What's the matter?" she asked in astonishment. "Nothing. Come back. I'm going to learn my letter," he said, stammering with fear. Heidi, however, herself wished to know where the Hottentots lived, and persisted that she should ask her grandfather, but she gave in at last to Peter's despairing entreaties. She insisted on his doing something in return, and so not only had he to present his Z until it was so fixed in his memory that he could never forget it again, but she began teaching him to spell, and Peter really made a good start that evening. So it went on from day to day. The frost had gone, and the snow was soft again, and moreover fresh snow continually fell, so that it was quite 3 weeks before Heidi could go to the grandmother again. So much the more eagerly did she pursue her teachings, so that Peter might compensate for her absence by reading hymns to the old woman. One evening he walked in home after leaving Heidi as he entered, and he said, "I can do it now." "Do what, Peter?" asked his mother. "Read," he answered. Do you really mean it? Did you hear that, grandmother? She called out. The grandmother had heard, and was already wondering how such a thing could come to pass. I must read one of the hymns now. Heidi told me to, he went on to inform them. His mother hastily brought the book, and the grandmother lay in joyful expectation, for it was so long since she had heard the good words. Peter sat down to the table and began to read. His mother sat beside him, listening with surprise, and exclaiming at the close of each verse, "Who would have thought it possible?" The grandmother did not speak, though she followed the words he read with strained attention. It happened on the day following this that there was a reading lesson in Peter's class. When it came to his term, the teacher said, "We must pass over Peter as usual, or will you try again once more? I will not say to read, but to stammer through a sentence." Peter took the book and read off 3 lines without the slightest hesitation. The teacher put down his book and stared at Peter as at some out-of-the-way and marvelous thing unseen before. At last he spoke. "Peter, some miracle has been performed upon you. Here have I been striving with unheard of patience to teach you, and you have not hitherto been able to say your letters, even. And now, just as I had made up my mind not to waste any more trouble upon you, you suddenly are able to read a whole sentence properly and distinctly. How has such a miracle come to pass in our days?" "It was Heidi," answered Peter. The teacher looked in astonishment towards Heidi, who was sitting innocently on her bench, with no appearance of anything supernatural about her. He continued, "I have noticed a change in you altogether, Peter. Whereas formerly you often missed coming to school for a week or even weeks at a time, you have lately not stayed away a single day. Who has wrought this change for good in you?" "It was Uncle," answered Peter. With increasing surprise, the teacher looked from Peter to Heidi and back again at Peter. "We will try once more," he said cautiously, and Peter had again to throw off his accomplishment by reading another 3 lines. There was no mistake about it. Peter could read. As soon as school was over, the teacher went over to the pastor to tell him his piece of news, and to inform him of the happy result of Heidi's and the grandfather's combined efforts. Every evening Peter read one hymn aloud, so far he obeyed Heidi. Nothing would induce him to read a second, and indeed the grandmother never asked for it. His mother Brigitte could not get over her surprise at her son's attainment, and when the reader was in bed, would often express her pleasure at it. "Now he has learned to read, there is no knowing what may be made of him yet." On one of these occasions the grandmother answered, "Yes, it is good for him to have learnt something, but I shall indeed be thankful when spring is here again, and Heidi can come. They are not like the same hymns when Peter reads them. So many words seem missing, and I try to think what they ought to be, and then I lose the sense, and so the hymn does not come home to my heart as when Heidi reads them." The truth was that Peter arranged to make his reading as little troublesome for himself as possible. When he came upon a word that he thought was too long or difficult in any way, he left it out, for he decided that a word or two less in a verse, where there were so many of them, could make no difference to his grandmother. And so it came about that most of the principal words were missing in the hymn that Peter read aloud. Oh yes, I wanted to show you before I continued. This is the cover of the book that I grew up with, like the exact edition. It is from 1944 and is very old and crumbly, and the ink isn't the clearest, so sometimes I stumble a little, which I apologize for. But this is the one that I'm reading from right now. The one I first read, the one I grew up with, and actually the one my mother grew up with as well. So let us continue. after a tiny break. Yeah. Chapter 20. A strange-looking procession. It was the month of May. The clear, warm sunshine lay upon the mountain, which had turned green again. The last snows had disappeared, and the sun had already coaxed many of the flowers to show their bright heads above the grass. Heidi was at home again on the mountain, running backwards and forwards in her accustomed way, not knowing which sport was most delightful. From the shed at the back came the sound of sawing and chopping, and Heidi listened to it with pleasure, for it was the old familiar sound she had known from the beginning of her life up here. Suddenly she jumped up and ran round, for she must know what her grandfather was doing. In front of the shed door, all ready, stood a finished new chair, and a second was in course of construction under the grandfather's skillful hand. "Oh, I know what those are for!" exclaimed Heidi in great glee. "We shall want them when they all come up from Frankfurt. This one is for Grandmama, and the one you are now making is for Clara, and then there will, I suppose, have to be another," continued Heidi, with more hesitation in her voice. "Or do you think, Grandfather, that perhaps Miss Rottermeier will not come with them?" "Well, I cannot say just yet," replied her grandfather, "but it will be safer to make one so that we can offer her a seat if she does." While talking with the grandfather, there was heard from above a whistling and calling which Heidi immediately recognized. She ran out and found herself surrounded by her four-footed friends. They were apparently as pleased as she was to be among the heights again, for they leaped about and bleated with joy. When Peter at last got up to her, he handed her a letter. "There!" he exclaimed. Did someone give you this while they were out with the goats?" she asked. "While you were out with the goats," she asked in her surprise. "No," was the answer. "Where did you get it from, then?" "I found it in the dinner bag." Which was true to a certain extent. The letter to Heidi had been given him the evening before by the postman at Dorfley, and Peter had put it into his empty bag. That morning he had stuffed his bread and cheese on the top of it, and had forgotten it when he called for Alm Uncle's 2 goats. Only when he had finished his bread and cheese at midday, and was searching in the bag for any last crumbs, did he remember the letter which lay at the bottom. Heidi read the address carefully. Then she ran back to the shed, holding out her letter for her grandfather in high glee. "From Frankfurt! From Clara! Would you like to hear it?" The grandfather was ready and pleased to do so, as was Peter, who had followed Heidi into the shed. "Dearest Heidi, everything is packed and we shall start now in 2 or 3 days, as soon as Papa himself is ready to leave. He is not coming with us, as he has first to go to Paris. The doctor comes every day, and as soon as he is inside the door he cries, 'Off now as quickly as you can, off to the mountains!' He is most impatient about our going. You cannot think how much he enjoyed himself when he was with you. He has called nearly every day this winter, and each time he describes over again all he did with you and the grandfather, and talks of the mountains and the flowers, and of the great silence up there far above all the towns and villages, and of the fresh, delicious air, and often adds, 'No one can help getting well up there.' He himself is quite a different man since his visit, and looks happy again. Oh, how I'm looking forward to seeing everything, and to being with you on the mountain, and to making the acquaintance of Peter and the goats. I shall have first to go through a 6 weeks' cure at Ragatz. This the doctor has ordered, and then we shall move up to Dorfley, and every fine day I shall be carried up the mountain in my chair, and spend the day with you. Grandmama is traveling with me, and will remain with me. She also is delighted at the thought of paying you a visit. But just imagine, Miss Rottermeier refuses to come with us. Almost every day Grandmama says to her, 'Well, how about this Swiss journey, my worthy Rottermeier? Pray say if you really would like to come with us.' But she always thanks Grandmama very politely, and says that she has quite made up her mind. I think I know what has done it. Sebastian gave such a frightful description of the mountain, of how the rocks were so overhanging and dangerous that at any minute you might fall into a crevasse, and how it and how it was such steep climbing that you feared at every step to go slipping to the bottom, and that goats alone would make their way up without fear of being killed. She shuddered when she heard him tell of all this, and since then she has not been so enthusiastic about Switzerland as she was before. Fear has also taken possession of Tinette, and she also refuses to come, so Grandmama and I will be alone. Sebastian will go with us as far as Regatz, and then return here. I can hardly bear waiting till I meet you again. Goodbye, dearest Heidi. Grandmama sends you her best love and all good wishes. Your affectionate friend, Clara. As soon as the letter had been read, Peter rushed out, twirling his stick in the air in such a reckless fashion that the frightened goats fled down the mountain before him with higher and wider leaps than usual. He followed at full speed, his stick still raising in air in a menacing manner, as if he was longing to vent his fury on some invisible foe. This foe was indeed the prospect of the arrival of the Frankfurt visitors, the thought of whom filled him with exasperation. Heidi was so full of joyful anticipation that she determined to seize the first possible moment next day to go down and tell Grandmother who was coming, and also particularly was not coming. The old lady was no longer confined to her bed. She was back in her corner at her spinning wheel, but there was an expression on her face of mournful anxiety. Peter had come in the evening before, brimful of anger, and had told about the large party who were coming up from Frankfurt, and he did not know what other things might happen after that, and the old woman had not slept all night, pursued by the old thought of Heidi being taken away from her. Heidi ran in, and taking her little stool, immediately sat down by Grandmother, and began eagerly pouring out all her news, growing more excited with her pleasure as she went on. But all of a sudden she stopped short and said anxiously, "What is the matter, Grandmother? Aren't you a bit pleased with what I am telling you?" Yes, of course, child, since it gives you so much pleasure," she answered, trying to look more cheerful. "But I can see all the same that something troubles you. Is it because you think after all that Miss Rothermere may come?" asked Heidi, beginning to feel anxious herself. No, it is nothing, child," said the grandmother, wishing to reassure her. "Just give me your hand that I may feel sure that you are there. No doubt it would be the best thing for you, although I feel I could scarcely survive it." "I do not want anything of the best if you could scarcely survive it," said Heidi in such a determined tone of voice that the grandmother's fears increased as she felt sure the people from Frankfurt were coming to take Heidi back with them, since now she was well again, they naturally wished to leave her with them once more. But she was anxious to hide her trouble from Heidi if possible, as the latter was so sympathetic that she might refuse perhaps to go away, and that would not be right. "Heidi," she said, "there is something that would comfort me and calm my thoughts, and read me the hymn beginning, 'All things will work for good.'" Heidi found the place at once and read out in her clear young voice, "All things will work for good to those who trust in me. I come with healing on my wings to save and set thee free." Yes, that is just what I wanted to hear," said the grandmother, and the deep expression of trouble passed from her face. Heidi looked at her thoughtfully for a minute or two, and then said, "Healing means that which cures everything and makes everybody well, doesn't it, Grandmother?" "Yes, that is it," replied the old woman with a nod of assent, "and we may be sure everything will come to pass according to God's good purpose." When the evening came, Heidi returned home up the mountain. The stars came out overhead one by one, so bright and sparkling that each seemed to send a fresh ray of joy into her heart. Not only were the nights of this month of May so clear and bright, but the days as well. The sun rose every morning into the cloudless sky, as undimmed in its splendor as when it sank the evening before, and the grandmother would look out early and exclaim with astonishment, "This is indeed a wonderful year of sun. Oh, the grandfather, sorry. This is indeed a wonderful year of sun. It will make all the shrubs and plants grow apace. You will have to see, General, that your army does not get out of hand from overfeeding. And Peter would swing his stick with an air of assurance and an expression on his face, as much as to say, I'll see to that. As May passed, everything growing greener and greener, and then came the month of June, with a hotter sun and long, light days that brought the flowers out all over the mountain, so that every spot was bright with them, and the air full of their sweet scents. This month, too, was drawing to its close, when one day Heidi, having finished her household duties, ran out with the intention of paying first a visit to the fir trees, and then going up higher to see if the bush of rock roses was yet in bloom, for its flowers were so lovely when standing open in the sun. But just as she was turning the corner of the hut, she gave such a loud cry that her grandfather came running out of the shed to see what had happened. "Grandfather! Grandfather!" she cried, beside herself with excitement. "Come here! Look! Look!" The old man was by her side by this time and looked in the direction of her outstretched hand. A strange-looking procession was making its way up the mountain. In front were two men carrying a sedan chair, in which sat a girl well wrapped up in shawls. Then followed a horse, mounted by a stately-looking lady who was looking about her with great interest and talking to the guide who walked beside her. Then a reclining chair, which was being pushed up by another man, it having evidently been thought safer to send the invalid to whom it belonged up the steep paths in a sedan chair. The procession wound up with a porter, with such a bundle of cloaks, shawls, and furs on his back that it rose all above his head. "Here they come! Here they come!" shouted Heidi, jumping with joy. And sure enough, it was the party from Frankfurt. The figures came nearer and nearer, and at last they were actually arrived. The men in front put down their burden. Heidi rushed forward, and the two children embraced each other with mutual delight. Grandmamma, having also reached the top, dismounted and gave Heidi an affectionate greeting, before turning to the grandfather, who had meanwhile come up to welcome his guests. There was no constraint about the meeting, for they both knew each other perfectly well from hearsay, and felt like old acquaintances. After the first words of greeting had been exchanged, Grandmamma broke out into lively expressions of admiration. "What a marvelous residence you have, uncle! I would hardly have believed it was so beautiful. A king might well envy you. And how well my little Heidi looks, like a wild rose," she continued, drawing the child towards her and stroking her fresh pink cheeks. "I don't know which way to look first, it is all so lovely. What do you say to it, Clara? What do you say?" Clara was gazing around entranced. She had never imagined, much less seen, anything so beautiful. She gave vent to her delight in cries of joy. "Oh, Grandmamma," she said, "I should like to remain here forever." And Grandfather had meanwhile drawn up the invalid chair and spread some of the wasp's wraps, all the same letters, wraps over it, and now went up to Clara. "Supposing we carry the little daughter now to her accustomed chair, I think she will be more comfortable. The traveling sedan is rather hard," he said, and without waiting for any one to help him, he lifted the child in his strong arms and laid her gently down on her own couch. Then he covered her over carefully and arranged her feet on the soft cushion, as if he had never done anything all his life but wait on cripples. The grandmamma looked on with surprise. "My dear uncle," she exclaimed, "if I knew where you would learn to nurse, I would at once send all the nurses I know to the same place, that they might handle their patients in like manner. How do you come to know so much?" Uncle smiled. "I know more from experience than training," he answered, but as he spoke the smile died away and a look of sadness passed over his face. The vision rose before him of the face of suffering that he had known long years before, the face of a man lying crippled on his couch of pain and unable to move a limb. The man had been his captain during the fierce fighting in Sicily. He had found him lying wounded and had carried him away, and after that the captain would suffer no one else near him, and Uncle stayed and nursed him till his suffering ended in death. It all came back to Uncle now, and it seemed natural to him to attend the sick Clara, and to show her all those kindly attentions with which he had once been so familiar. "Oh, Heidi, if only I could walk about with you," said Clara longingly. "If I could go and look at the fir trees and everything I know so well from your description, although I have never been here before." Heidi, in response, put out all her strength, and after a slight effort, managed to wheel Clara's chair quite easily round the hut to the fir trees. There they paused. Clara had never seen such trees before, with their tall, straight stems and long, thick branches growing thicker and thicker till they touched the ground. Even the grandmamma, who had followed the children, was astonished at the sight of them. Heidi had now wheeled Clara toward the goat shed, and had flung open the door so that Clara might have a full view of the inside. Clara lamented to her grandmother that they would have to leave early before the goats came home. "I should like to have seen Peter and his whole flock." "Oh, the flowers!" exclaimed Clara. "Look at the bushes of red flowers and all the nodding bluebells. Oh, if I could but get out and pick one." Heidi ran off at once and picked her a large nosegay of them. But these are nothing, Clara," she said, laying the flowers in her lap. "If you could come up higher to where the goats are feeding, then you would indeed see something. Bushes on bushes of the red centauri, and ever so many more of the bluebell flowers, and then the bright yellow rock roses that gleam like pure gold, and all crowding together in the one spot. And then there are other things with large leaves that grandfather calls bright eyes, and the brown ones with little round heads that smell so delicious. Oh, it is beautiful up there, and if you sit down among them, you never want to get up again. Everything looks and smells so lovely." Heidi's eyes sparkled with the remembrance of what she was describing. She was longing herself to see it all again, and Clara caught her enthusiasm and looked back at her with equal longing in her soft blue eyes. "Grandmamma, do you think I could get up there? Is it possible for me to go?" she asked eagerly. "If only I could walk, climb about everywhere with you, Heidi." "I'm sure I could push you up. The chair goes so easily," said Heidi, and in proof of her words she sent the chair at such a pace round the corner that it nearly went flying down the mountainside. Grandmamma, being at hand, however, stopped it in time. The grandfather, meantime, had not been idle. He had by this time put the table and extra chairs in front of the seat, so that they might all still be out and eat the dinner that was preparing inside. The milk and the cheeses were soon ready, and then the company sat down in high spirits to their midday meal. Grandmamma was enchanted, as the doctor had been, with their dining room, whence one could see far along the valley, and far over the mountain to the farthest stretch of blue sky. A light wind blew refreshingly over them as they sat at table, and the rustling of the fir trees made a festive accompaniment to the repast. "I never enjoyed anything as much as this. It is really superb," cried the grandmamma 2 or 3 times over, and then suddenly, in a tone of surprise, "Do I really see you taking a second piece of toasted cheese, Clara?" There, sure enough, was a second golden-colored slice of cheese on Clara's plate. "Oh, it does taste so nice, Grandmamma. Better than all the dishes we have at Ragaz's," replied Clara, as she continued eating with appetite. "That's right, eat what you can," exclaimed Uncle. "It's the mountain air which makes up for the deficiencies of the kitchen." And so the meal went on. Grandmamma and Uncle got on very well together, and their conversation became more and more lively. They were so thoroughly agreed in their opinions of men and things in the world in general, that they might have been taken for old cronies. The time passed merrily, and when Grandmamma looked towards the west and said, We must soon be ready to go, Clara. The sun is a good way down. The men will be here directly with the horse and sedan. Clara's face fell, and she said beseechingly, "Oh, just another hour, Grandmamma, or 2 hours. We haven't seen anything inside the hut yet, or Heidi's bed, or any of the other things. If only the day was 10 hours long." "Well, that is not possible," said Grandmamma, but she herself was anxious to see inside the hut, so they all rose from the table, and Uncle wheeled Clara's chair to the door. But there they came to a standstill, for the chair was much too broad to pass through the door. Uncle, however, soon settled the difficulty by lifting Clara in his strong arms and carrying her inside. Grandmamma went all round and examined the household arrangements, and was very much amused and pleased at their orderliness and the cozy appearance of everything. "And this is your bedroom up there, Heidi, is it now?" she asked, as without fear she mounted the ladder to the hayloft. "Oh, it does smell sweet. What a healthy place to sleep in." "Except if you have allergies." She went up to the round window and looked out, and Grandfather followed up with Clara in his arms, Heidi springing up after them. Then they all stood and examined Heidi's wonderful hay bed, and the Grandmamma looked thoughtfully at it, and drew in from time to time fragrant draughts of the sweet hay-perfumed air, while Clara was charmed beyond words with the sleeping apartment. "It is delightful for you up here, Heidi. You can look from your bed straight into the sky, and then such a delicious smell all around you, and outside the fir trees waving and rustling. I have never seen such a pleasant, cheerful bedroom before." Uncle looked across at the Grandmamma. "I've been thinking," he said to her, "that if you were willing to agree to it, your little granddaughter might remain up here, and I'm sure she would grow stronger. You have brought up all kinds of shawls and covers with you, and we could make up a soft bed out of them, and as to looking after the child, you need have no fear, for I will see to that." Clara and Heidi were so overjoyed at these words, as if they were 2 birds let out of their cages, and Grandmamma's face beamed with satisfaction. "You are indeed kind, my dear uncle," she exclaimed. "I was just thinking myself that a stay up here might be the very thing she wanted. But then the trouble, the inconvenience to yourself, and you speak of nursing and looking after her as if it were a mere nothing. I thank you sincerely. I thank you from my whole heart, uncle." And she took his hand and gave it a long and grateful shake, which he returned with a pleased expression of countenance. Uncle immediately set to work to get things ready. He carried Clara back to her chair outside, Heidi following, not knowing how to jump high enough into the air to express her contentment. Then he gathered up a whole pile of shawls and furs and said, smiling, "It is a good thing that Grandmamma came up well provided for a winter's campaign. We shall be able to make good use of these." The 2 had meanwhile ascended to the hayloft and began to prepare a bed. There were so many articles piled one over the other that when finished it looked like a regular little fortress. Grandmamma passed her hand carefully over it to make sure that there were no bits of hay sticking out. "If there's a bit that can come through, it will," she said. The soft mattress, however, was so smooth and thick that nothing could penetrate it. Then they went down again, well satisfied, and found the children laughing and talking together and arranging all they were going to do for the morning, from morning till evening, as long as Clara stayed. The next question was how long she was to remain, and first Grandmamma was asked, but she referred then to the grandfather, who gave it as his opinion that she ought to make trial of the mountain air for at least a month. The children clapped their hands for joy, for they had not expected to be together for so long a time. The bearers and the horse and guide were now seen approaching. The former were sent back at once, and Grandmamma prepared to mount for her return journey. "I'm not saying goodbye to Grandmamma," Clara called out, "for you will come up now and then and see how we are getting on, and we shall so look forward to your visits." Grandmamma mounted her sturdy animal, and Uncle took the bridle to lead her down steep mountain path. She begged him not to come far with her, but he insisted on seeing her safely as far as Dorfley, for the way was precipitous, and not without danger for the rider, he said. Grandmamma did not care to stay alone in Dorfley, and therefore decided to return to Ragaz, and thence to make excursions up the mountain from time to time. Peter came down with his goats before Uncle had returned. As soon as the animals caught sight of Heidi, they all came flocking towards her, and she, as well as Clara on her couch, were soon surrounded by the goats, pushing and poking their heads one over the other, while Heidi introduced each in turn by its name to her friend Clara. It was not long before the latter had made the long-wished-for acquaintance of a little snowflake, the lively greenfinch, and the well-behaved goats belonging to Grandfather, as well as the many others, including the Grand Turk. Peter, meanwhile, stood apart looking on and casting somewhat unfriendly glances towards Clara. When the two children called out, "Good evening, Peter," he made no answer, but swung his stick angrily, as if wanting to cut the air in two, and then ran off with his goats after him. The climax to all the beautiful things that Clara had already seen upon the mountain came at a close of the day. As she lay on the large, soft bed in the hayloft, with Heidi near her, she looked out through the round, open window, right into the middle of the shining cluster of stars, and she exclaimed in delight, "Heidi, it's just as if we were in a high carriage and were going to drive straight into the heavens." "Yes, and do you know why the stars are so happy and look down and nod at us like that?" asked Heidi. "No, why is it?" Clara asked in return. "Because they live up in heaven and know how well God arranges everything for us, so that we need have no more fear or trouble, and may be quite sure that all things will come right in the end. But then we must never forget to pray and to ask God to remember us when He is arranging things, so that we too may feel safe and have no anxiety about what is going to happen." The two children now sat up and said their prayers, and then Heidi put her head down on her little round arm and fell off to sleep at once. But Clara lay awake for some time, for she could not get over the wonder of this new experience of being in bed up there among the stars. She had indeed seldom seen a star, for she never went outside the house at night, and the curtains at home were always drawn before the stars came out. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt she must open them again to see if the two very large stars were still looking in, and nodding to her as Heidi said they did. They were there. There they were, always in the same place. At last her eyes closed of their own accord, and it was only in her dreams that she still saw the two large, friendly stars shining down upon her. Chapter 21. Happy days for the little visitor. Next morning at sunrise, Uncle went softly up the ladder to see if the children were awake yet. Clara had just opened her eyes and was looking with wonder at the bright sunlight that shone through the round window and danced and sparkled about her bed. She could not at first think where she was, until she caught sight of Heidi sleeping beside her and heard the grandfather's cheery voice asking her if she had slept well. She assured him that when she had once fallen asleep, she had not opened her eyes again all night. The grandfather was satisfied at this, and immediately began to help her dress with so much gentleness and understanding that it seemed as if his chief calling had been to look after sick children. When Heidi awoke, she was surprised to see Clara dressed and already in the grandfather's arms, ready to be carried down. She hurried up too, and soon ran down the ladder and out of the hut, and there further astonishment awaited her, for Grandfather had been busy the night before, after they were in bed. Seeing that it was impossible to get Clara's chair through the hut door, he had taken down two of the boards at the side of the shed, and made an opening large enough to admit the chair. These he left loose as they could be taken away and put up at his pleasure. He was at this moment wheeling Clara out into the sun. He left her in front of the hut while he went to look after the goats, and Heidi ran up to her friend. "Oh, Heidi, if only I could stay up here forever with you," exclaimed Clara happily, turning in her chair from side to side that she might drink in the air and sun from all quarters. "Now you see that it is just what I told you," replied Heidi, delighted. "That it is the most beautiful thing in the world to be up here with Grandfather." The latter at that moment appeared coming from the goat shed and bringing 2 small foaming bowls of snow-white milk, one for Clara and one for Heidi. "That will do the little daughter good," he said, nodding to Clara. "It is from little Snow, and will make her strong. To your health, child. Drink it up." Clara had never tasted goat's milk before. She hesitated and smelt it before putting it to her lips, but seeing how Heidi drank hers up without hesitation, and how much she seemed to like it, Clara did the same, and drank all till there was not a drop left, for she too found it delicious, tasting just as if sugar and cinnamon had been mixed with it. "Tomorrow we will drink 2, said the grandfather, who had been looking on with satisfaction at seeing her follow Heidi's example. When Peter arrived with the goats, Uncle drew him aside and said, "From today be sure you let little Snow go where she likes. She knows where to find the best food for herself, and so if she wants to climb higher, you follow her, and it will do the others no harm if they go too. The little more climbing won't hurt you, and in this matter she probably knows better than you what is good for her. I want her to give as fine milk as possible. So now be off and remember what I say, and don't look so cross about it." Peter was accustomed to give immediate obedience to Uncle, and he marched off with his goats, but with a turn of his head and a roll of his eyes that showed he had some thought in reserve. The goats carried Heidi along with them a little ways, which was what Peter wanted. You will have to come with them," he called to her, "for I shall be obliged to follow Little Swan." "I cannot," Heidi called back from the midst of her friends, "and I shall not be able to come for a long, long time, not as long as Clara is with me. Grandfather, however, has promised to go up the mountain with both of us some day." As Heidi ran back to Clara, Peter doubled his fists and made threatening gestures toward the invalid in her couch, and then climbed up some distance without pause until he was out of sight, for he was afraid Uncle might have seen him. Clara and Heidi had made so many plans for themselves that they hardly knew where to begin. Heidi suggested that they should first write to Grandmama, whom they had promised to send word every day, for Grandmama had not felt sure whether it would in the long run suit Clara's health to remain up the mountain. With daily news of her granddaughter, she could stay on without anxiety at regattes, and yet be ready to go to Clara at a moment's notice. "Must we go indoors to write?" asked Clara. "It is so much nicer out here." So Heidi ran in and brought out her school book and writing things and her own little stool. She put her reading book and copy book on Clara's knees to make a desk for her to write on, and she herself took her seat on the stool by the bench, and then they both began writing to Grandmama. But Clara paused after every sentence to look about her. It was so beautiful for much letter writing. Oh, it was too beautiful. The breeze had sunk a little, and now only gently fanning her face. Oh, hang on a second. Getting a little froggy. The breeze had sunk a little, and now only gently fanned her face and whispered lightly through the fir trees. Now and again the call of some shepherd boy rang out through the air, and the echo answered softly from the rocks. Thus, something passed, the children hardly knew how. Thus morning passed. The children hardly knew how, and soon Grandfather came with the midday bowls of steaming milk. Then Heidi pushed Clara's chair under the fir tree, where they spent the afternoon in the shade, telling each other all of the things that had happened since last they met. So the hours flew by all at once, as it seemed. The evening had come with the returning Peter, who still scowled and looked angry. "Good night, Peter," called out Heidi, as she saw he had no intention of stopping to speak. "Good night, Peter," called out Clara in a friendly voice. Peter took no notice and went surlily, yeah, I know it's supposed to be surly, on with his goats. As Clara saw the grandfather leading away little Swan to milk her, she was suddenly taken with a longing for another bowl of the fragrant milk and waited impatiently for it. "Isn't it curious, Heidi?" she said, astonished at herself. "As long as I can remember, I have only eaten because I was obliged to, and everything used to seem to taste of cod liver oil, and I was always wishing there was no need to eat or drink. Now I am longing for grandfather to bring me the milk." "Yes, I know what it feels like," replied Heidi, who remembered the many days in Frankfurt when all her food used to seem to stick in her throat. When grandfather at last brought the evening milk, Clara drank it up so quickly that she had emptied her bowl before Heidi, and then she asked for a little more. The grandfather went inside with both the children's bowls, and when he brought them out again full, he had something else to add to their supper. He had walked over that afternoon to a herdsman's house where the sweetly tasting butter was made, and had brought home a large pat, some of which had been now spread thickly on 2 good slices of bread. That night, when Clara lay down in her bed and prepared to watch the stars, her eyes would not keep open, and she fell asleep as soon as Heidi, and slept soundly all night. The things she never remembered having done before. The following day and the day after passed in the same pleasant fashion, and the third day there came a surprise for the children. 2 stout porters came up the mountain, each carrying a bed on his shoulders with bedding of all kinds, and 2 beautiful new white coverlids. The men also had a letter from them with them from the grandmamma, in which she said that these were for Clara and Heidi, and that Heidi in future was always to sleep in a proper bed, and when she went down to Dorfli in the winter, she was to take one with her and leave the other at the hut, so that Clara might always know there was a bed ready for her when she paid a visit to the mountain. She went on to thank the children for their long letters, and encouraged them to continue writing daily, so that she might be able to picture all they were doing. Grandfather went up the ladder and threw back the hay from Heidi's bed onto the great heap. And soon the beds were put up close to one another, so that the children might still be able to see out of the window, for he knew what pleasure they had in the light from the sun and stars. Meanwhile, Grandmamma down at Ragatz was rejoicing at the excellent news of the invalid, which reached her daily from the mountains. Clara found the life more charming each day, and could not say enough of the kindness and care which the grandfather lavished upon her, nor of Heidi's lively and amusing companionship. Having such fresh assurances each day that all was going well with Clara, Grandmamma thought she might put off her visit to the children a little longer, for the steep ride up and down was somewhat of a fatigue to her. The grandfather seemed to feel an especial sympathy for his little invalid charge, for he tried to think of something fresh every day to help forward her recovery. He climbed up the mountain every afternoon, higher and higher each day, and came home in the evening with large bunches of leaves which scented the air with a mingled fragrance as of carnations in thyme. He hung them up in the goat's shed for little Swan to eat, so that she might give extra fine milk. Clara had now been on the mountain for 3 weeks. For some days past, the grandfather, each morning after carrying her down, had said, "Won't the little daughter try if she can stand for a minute or two?" And Clara had made the effort in order to please him, but had clung to him as soon as her feet touched the ground, exclaiming that it hurt her so. He let her try a little longer, however, each day. It was many years since they had had such a splendid summer among the mountains. Day after day there was the same cloudless sky and brilliant sun. The flowers opened wide their fragrant blossoms, and everywhere the eye was greeted with a glow of color. And when the evening came, the crimson light fell on mountain peaks and on the great snow field, till at last the sun sank in a sea of golden flame. Heidi never tired of telling Clara of the beauty of the spot on the higher slope of the mountain, where the bright golden rock roses grew in masses, and the blue flowers were in such numbers that the very grass seemed to have turned blue. An irrepressible longing came over her to see it all once more. She ran to her grandfather, who was in the shed, calling out almost before she was inside, "Grandfather, will you take us out with the goats tomorrow? Oh, it is so lovely up there now." "Very well," he replied. "But if I do, little Clara must do something to please me. She must try her best again this evening to stand on her feet." Heidi ran back with the good news to Clara, and the latter promised to try her very best, as the grandfather wished, for she looked forward immensely to the next day's excursion. Heidi was so pleased and excited that she called out to Peter as soon as she caught sight of him that evening. "Peter! Peter, we are all coming out with you tomorrow and are going to stay up there the whole day." Peter, cross as a bear, grumbled some reply and lifted his stick to give Greenfinch a blow for no reason in particular, but Greenfinch saw the movement, and with a leap over Snowflake's back, she was out of the way and the stick only hit the air. Clara and Heidi got into their own 2 fine beds that night, full of delightful anticipation of the morrow. They were so full of their plans that they agreed to keep awake all night and talk over them. But their heads had no sooner touched their soft pillows than the conversation suddenly ceased, and Clara fell into a dream of an immense field which looked the color of the sky, so thickly inlaid was it with blue, bell-shaped flowers, and Heidi heard the great bird of prey calling to her from the heights above, "Come! Come! Come!" Chapter 22. Wicked Peter and the Unlucky Chair. Uncle went out early the next morning to see what kind of a day it was going to be. There was a reddish-gold light over the higher peaks. A light breeze was springing up, and the branches in the fir trees moved gently to and fro. The sun was on its way. He wheeled the chair out of the shed, ready for the coming journey, and then went in to call the children and tell them what a lovely sunrise it was. Peter came up the mountain at this moment. The goats did not gather round him so trustfully as usual, but seemed to avoid him timidly, for he had reached a high pitch of anger and bitterness, and was using his stick very unnecessarily, and where it fell the blow was no light one. For weeks now he had not had Heidi all to himself as formerly. When he came up in the morning, the invalid chair was always ready in her... The invalid child was always... For weeks now he had not had Heidi all to himself as formerly. When he came up in the morning, the invalid child was always already in her chair, and Heidi fully occupied with her. It was the same thing over again when he came down in the evening. She had not come out with the goats once this summer, and today she was only coming in company with her friend in the chair, and would stick by the latter's side the whole time. It was the thought of this which was making him particularly cross this morning. There stood the chair in its high wheels. Peter glared at it as if at an enemy that had done him harm, and was likely to do him still more today. He glanced around. There was no sound anywhere, no one to see him. He sprang forward like a wild creature, caught hold of the chair, and gave it a violent and angry push in the direction of the slope. It rolled swiftly forward, and in another minute had disappeared. Peter now sped up the mountain as if on wings, not pausing till he was well hidden behind a large blackberry bush, for he had no wish to be seen by Uncle. But he was anxious to see what had become of the chair, so he looked, and there he saw his enemy running faster and faster downhill. Then it turned head over heels several times, and finally, after one great bound rolled over and over to its complete destruction. The pieces flew in every direction, feet, arms, and torn fragments of the padded seat and bolster. And Peter experienced a feeling of such unbounded delight at the sight that he leapt in the air, laughing aloud and stamping for joy. He could see only good results for himself in the disaster to his enemy. Now Heidi's friend would be obliged to go away, for she would have no means of going about, and when Heidi was alone again, she would come out with him as soon as in the old days, and everything would go in the proper place, in the proper way. But Peter did not consider, or did he not know, that when we do a wrong thing, trouble is sure to follow. Heidi now came running out of the hut and round the shed. Grandfather was behind with Clara in his arms. The shed stood wide open, the 2 loose planks having been taken down, and it was quite light inside. Heidi looked into every corner and ran from one end to the other, and then stood still wondering what would have happened to the chair. Grandfather now came up. "How is this? Have you wheeled the chair away, Heidi?" "I have been looking everywhere for it, Grandfather. You said it was standing ready outside." And she again searched every corner of the shed with her eyes. At that moment the wind, which had risen suddenly, blew open the shed door and sent it banging back against the wall. "It must have been the wind, Grandfather," exclaimed Heidi, and her eyes grew anxious at this sudden discovery. "Oh, if it has blown the chair all the way down to Dorfley, we shall not get it back in time, and shall not be able to go." "If it has rolled as far as that, it will never come back, for it is in 100 pieces by now," said the grandfather, going round the corner and looking down. "But it's a curious thing to have happened," he added, as he thought over the matter, "that the chair would not have had a turn in the corner before starting downhill. Had to turn a corner." "Oh, I'm sorry," lamented Clara, "for we shall not be able to go today, or perhaps any other day. I shall have to go home, I suppose. I have no chair." "Oh, I'm so sorry, I am so sorry." But Heidi looked towards her grandfather with her usual expression of confidence. "Grandfather, you will be able to do something, won't you? So that it will need not be as Clara says, and so that she is not obliged to go home?" "Well, for the present we will go up the mountain as we had arranged, and then later on we will see what can be done," he answered, much to the children's delight. "Well, yes, here we are." He went indoors, carried out a pile of shawls, and laying them on the sunniest spot he could find, set Clara down upon them. Then he brought the children's morning milk and led out his 2 goats. "Why is Peter not here yet?" thought Uncle to himself, for Peter's whistle had not been sounded that morning. The grandfather then took Clara up on one arm, and the shawls on the other. "Now then we will start," he said. "The goats can come with us." Heidi was pleased at this, and walked on after her grandfather with an arm over either of the goats' necks, and the animals were so overjoyed to have her again that they nearly squeezed her flat between them out of sheer affection. When they reached the spot where the goats usually pastured, they were surprised to find them already feeding there, climbing about the rocks, and Peter with them, lying his full length on the ground. "I'll teach you another time to go by like that, you lazy rascal! What do you mean by it?" Uncle called to him. Peter recognized the voice and jumped up like a shot. "No one was up," he answered. "Have you seen anything of the chair?" asked the grandfather. "Of what chair?" called Peter back in answer in a morose tone of voice. Uncle said no more. He spread the shawls on the sunny slope and settled Clara upon them, asked if she was comfortable. "As comfortable as in my chair," she said, thanking him. "And this seems the most beautiful spot. Oh, Heidi, it is lovely, she cried, looking round her with delight. The grandfather prepared to leave them. They would now be safe and happy together, he said, and when it was time for dinner, Heidi was to go and bring the bag from the shady hollow where he had put it. Peter was to get them as much milk as they wanted, but Heidi was to see that it was little swan's milk. He would come for them towards evening. He must now be off to see after the chair and find out what had become of it. The sky was dark blue, and not a single cloud was to be seen from one horizon to the next. The great snowfield overhead sparkled as if beset with thousands and thousands of gold and silver stars. Now and again a young goat came and lay down beside them. Snowflake came oftenest, putting her little head down near Heidi, and only moving because another goat came and drove her away. And the goats had also grown familiar with Clara, and would rub their heads against her shoulder, which was always a sign of acquaintanceship and goodwill. Some hours went by, and Heidi began to think that she might just go over to the spot where all the flowers grew to see if they were really fully blown and looking as lovely as the year before. Clara could not go until grandfather came back that evening, when the flowers probably would be already closed, and longing to go became stronger and stronger, till Heidi felt she could not resist it. "Would you think me unkind, Clara," she said rather hesitantly, "if I left you for a few minutes? I could run back there and back very quickly. I want to see how the flowers are looking. But wait!" For an idea had come into Heidi's head. She ran and picked a bunch or two of green leaves, and then took hold of Snowflake and led her up to Clara. "There, now you will not be alone." And Heidi, giving the goat a little push to show her she was to lie down near Clara, which the animal quite understood. Heidi threw the leaves into Clara's lap, and the latter told her friend to go at once to look at the flowers, as she was quite happy to be left with the goat. She liked this new experience. Heidi ran off, and Clara began to hold out the leaves one by one to Snowflake, who snuggled up to her new friend in a confiding manner, and slowly ate the leaves from her hand. She found a strange new pleasure in sitting all alone like this on the mountain side, her only companion a little goat that looked to her for protection. She suddenly felt a great desire to be her own mistress, and to be able to help others, instead of herself being always dependent as she was now. Many thoughts, unknown to her before, came crowding into her mind, and a longing to go on living in the sunshine, and to be doing something that would bring happiness to another, as now she was helping to make the goat happy. An unaccustomed feeling of joy took possession of her, as if everything she had ever known or felt became all at once more beautiful, and she seemed to see all things in a new light, and so strong was the sense of this new beauty and happiness that she threw her arms round the little goat's neck and exclaimed, "Oh, Snowflake, how delightful it is up here! If only I could stay on forever with you beside me." Heidi had meanwhile reached her field of flowers, and as she caught sight of it she uttered a cry of joy. The whole ground in front of her was a mass of shimmering gold, where the citrus flowers spread their yellow blossoms. Above them, cistus flowers, I do that every time. Above them waved whole bushes of the deep bluebell flowers. Heidi stood and gazed and drew in the delicious air. Suddenly she turned round and reached Clara's side out of breath with running excitement. "Oh, you must come," she called out as soon as she came in sight. "It is more beautiful than you can imagine, and perhaps this evening it may not be so lovely. I believe I could carry you. Don't you think I could?" Clara looked at her and shook her head. "Why, Heidi, what can you be thinking of? You are smaller than I am." "Oh, if only I could walk." Heidi looked round as if in search of something. Some new idea had evidently come into her head. Peter was sitting above, looking down on the two children. He had been sitting and staring before him in the same way for hours, as if he could not make out what he saw. He had destroyed the chair so that the friend might not be able to move anywhere, and that her visit might come to an end, and then a little while after she had appeared right up here under his very nose with Heidi beside her. He thought his eyes must deceive him, and yet there she was, and no mistake about that. Heidi looked up to where he was sitting and called out in a commanding voice, "Peter, come down here." "I don't wish to come," he called in reply. "But you must. I cannot do it alone, and you must come here and help me. Make haste and come down," she called again in an urgent voice. "I shall do nothing of the kind," was the answer. Heidi ran some way up the slope toward him, and then, pausing, called again, her eyes ablaze with anger, "If you don't come at once, Peter, I will do something to you that you won't like. I mean what I say." Peter felt an inward throe at these words, and a great fear seized him. He had done something wicked which he wanted no one to know about, and so far he had thought himself safe. But now Heidi spoke exactly as if she knew everything, and whatever she did know, she would tell her grandfather, and there was no one he feared so much as this latter person. Supposing he were to suspect what had happened about the chair? Peter's anguish of mind grew more acute. He stood up and went down to where Heidi was waiting for him. "I'm coming, and you won't do what you have said." Peter appeared now so submissive with fear that Heidi felt quite sorry for him and answered assuredly, No, of course not. Come along with me. There is nothing to be afraid of in what I want you to do." As soon as they got to Clara, Heidi gave her orders. Peter was to take hold of her under the arms on one side, and she on the other, and together they were to lift her up. This first movement was successfully carried through, and then came the difficulty. As Clara could not even stand, how were they to support her and get her along? Heidi was too small for her arm to serve Clara to lean upon. "You must put one arm well round my neck, so, and put the other round Peter's and lean firmly upon it. Then we shall be able to carry you." Peter, however, had never given his arm to anyone in his life. Clara put hers in his, but he kept his own hanging down straight beside him like a stick. "That's not the way," said Heidi in an authoritative voice. "You must put your arm out in the shape of a ring, and Clara must put hers through it and lean her weight upon you. And whatever you do, don't let your arm give way. Like that I am sure we shall be able to manage." Peter did as he was told, but still he did not get on very well. Clara was not such a lightweight, but the team did not match very well in size. It was up one side and down the other, so that the supports were rather wobbly. Clara tried to use her own feet a little, but each time drew them quickly back. "Put your foot down firmly once," suggested Heidi. "I am sure it will hurt you less after that." "Do you think so?" said Clara hesitatingly, but she followed Heidi's advice and ventured one firm step on the ground and then another. She called out a little as she did it. Then she lifted her foot again and went on. "Oh, that was less painful already," she exclaimed joyfully. "Try again," said Heidi encouragingly, and Clara went on, putting one foot out after another, until all at once she called out, "I can do it, Heidi! Look! I can make proper steps!" And Heidi cried out with even greater delight, "Can you really make steps? Can you really walk? Really walk by yourself? Oh, if only grandfather were here!" And she continued gleefully to exclaim, "You can walk now, Clara, you can walk!" Clara still held on firmly to her supports, but with every step she felt safer on her feet, as all three became aware, and Heidi was beside herself with joy. "Now we shall be able to come up here together every day, and just go where we like, and you will be able to walk about as I do, and not have to be pushed in a chair, and we will get quite strong and well. It is the greatest happiness we could have had." And Clara heartily agreed, for she could think of no greater joy in the world than to be strong and able to go about like other people, and no longer have to lie from day to day in her invalid chair. "Hi, Penguin, I'm glad you made it. We still have a little bit of a ways to go." And Clara heartily agreed. Oh, I already read that part. They had not far to go to reach the field of flowers, and could already catch sight of the cistus flowers glowing gold in the sun. As they came to the bushes of the bluebell flowers, with sunny, inviting patches of warm ground between them, Clara said, "Can't we sit down here for a while?" This was just what Heidi had enjoyed, and so the children sat down in the midst of the flowers, Clara for the first time on the dry, warm mountain grass, and she found it indescribably delightful. Everything was so lovely, so lovely. And Heidi, who was beside herself, thought she had never seen it so perfectly beautiful up here before.
Yeah, late is better than never. I am glad to... Oh, and I wanted to show you something. I showed John earlier. This right here is the book cover of the book that I'm reading. This is the one that I grew up with, and my mother grew up with it. It was printed in 1944, this specific edition. So if I stumble a little, it's probably because of the old ink on the old pages. Plus, they keep forgetting... Yes, it is very old. Plus, they keep forgetting quotation marks. Let's see. Then she suddenly remembered that Clara was cured. That was the crowning delight of all that made life so delightful in the midst of all this surrounding beauty. Clara sat silent, overcome with the enchantment of all that her eyes rested upon, and with the anticipation of all the happiness that was now before her. There seemed hardly room in her heart for all her joyful emotions. Peter also lay among the flowers without moving or speaking, for he was fast asleep. The breeze came blowing softly and carelessly from behind the sheltering rocks, and passed whisperingly through the bushes overhead. Heidi got up now and then to run about, for the flowers waving in the warm wind seemed to smell sweeter and to grow more thickly whichever way she went. So the hours went by. It was long past noon until a small troop of goats advanced solemnly towards the plain of flowers. It was not a feeding place of theirs, for they did not care to graze on flowers. They looked like an embassy thriving, with greenfinches their leader. They had evidently come in search of their companions, who had left them in the lurch, and who had remained away so long, for the goats could tell the time without mistake. As soon as Greenfinch caught sight of the three missing friends amid the flowers, she set up an extra loud bleat, whereupon all the others jumped in a chorus of bleats, and the whole company came throttling towards the children. Peter woke up, rubbing his eyes, for he had been dreaming that he saw the chair again with its beautiful red padding, standing whole and uninjured before the grandfather's door. He experienced again the dreadful fear of mind that he had lost in his dream of the uninjured chair. Even though Heidi had promised not to do anything, there still remained the lively dread that this deed might be found out in some other way. He allowed Heidi to do what she liked with him, for he was reduced to such a state of low spirits and meekness that he was ready to give his help to Clara without murmur or resistance. When all three had got back to their old quarters, Heidi ran and brought forward the bag and proceeded to fulfill her promise, for her threat of the morning had been concerned with Peter's dinner. She had seen her grandfather putting in all sorts of good things, and had been pleased to think of Peter having a large share of them, and she had meant him to understand, when he refused at first to help her, that he would get nothing for his dinner. But Peter's conscience had put another interpretation upon the words. Heidi took the food out of the bag and divided it into 3 portions, and each was of such a goodly size that she thought to herself, "There will be plenty of ours left for him to have more still." She gave the other 2 their dinners, and sat down with her own besides Clara, and they all 3 ate with a good appetite after their great exertions. Peter ate up every bit of food to the last crumb, but there was something wanting to his usual enjoyment of a good dinner, for every more mouthful he swallowed seemed to choke him, and he felt something gnawing inside himself. They were so late at their dinner that they had not long to wait after they had finished before Grandfather came up to get them. Heidi rushed forward to meet him as soon as he appeared, and she wanted to be the first to tell him the good news. She was so excited that she could hardly get her words out when she did get up to him, but he soon understood, and a look of extreme pleasure came into his face. He hastened up to where Clara was sitting, and said with a cheerful smile, "So, we've made the effort, have we, and won the day?" Then he lifted her up, and putting his left arm behind her, and giving her his right to lean upon, made her walk a little the way.
which she did with less trembling and hesitation than before, now that she had such a strong arm round her. Heidi skipped along beside her in glee, and the grandfather looked, too, as if some happiness had befallen him. "We must not overdo it," he said, taking Clara up in his arms. It is high time we went home," and he started off down the mountain path, for he was anxious to get her indoors, that she might rest after her unusual fatigue. When Peter got to Dorfley that evening, he found a large group of people collecting round a certain spot, pushing one after another, and looking over each other's shoulder in their eagerness to catch sight of something lying on the ground. Peter thought he should like to see too, and poked and elbowed till he made his way through. There it lay, the thing he had wanted to see. Shattered about the grass were the remains of Clara's chair, part of the back and the middle bit, and enough of the red padding and the bright nails to show how magnificent the chair had been when it was entire. "It was here when the men passed carrying it up. I was here when the men passed carrying it up," said the baker, who was standing near Peter. "I'll bet any one that it was worth $125 at least. I cannot think how such an accident could have happened." "That is a lot of money back then." "Uncle said the wind might have perhaps have done it," remarked one of the women. "It's a good job that no one but the wind did it," said the baker again, "or he might smart for it. No doubt the gentleman in Frankfurt, when he hears what has happened, will make inquiries about it. I'm glad for myself that I have not been seen up the mountain for a good 2 years. A suspicion is likely to fall on any one who was up there at the time." Many more opinions were passed on the matter, but Peter had heard enough. He crept quietly away out of the crowd, and then took to his heels and ran up home as fast as he could, as if he thought someone was after him. The baker's words had filled him with fear and trembling. He was sure now that any day a constable might come over from Frankfurt and inquire about the destruction of the chair, and then everything would come out, and he would be seized and carried to Frankfurt, and there put in prison. He reached home in his disturbed state of mind. He would not open his mouth and reply to anything that was said to him. He would not eat his potatoes. All he did was to creep off to bed as quickly as possible, and to hide under the bedclothes and groan. "Peter has been eating sorrel again, and is evidently in pain by the way he is groaning," said his mother. "You must give him a little more bread to take with him. Give him a little bit of mine tomorrow," said the grandmother sympathetically. As the children lay that night in bed, looking out at the stars, Heidi said, "I have been thinking all day what a happy thing it is that God does not give us what we ask for, even when we pray and pray and pray. If he knows there is something better for us. Have you felt that?" "Why do you ask me that tonight all of a sudden?" asked Clara. "Because I prayed so hard when I was in Frankfurt that I might go home at once, and because I was not allowed to, I thought God had forgotten me. And now you see, as I had come away at first, if I had come away at first when I wanted to, you would never have come here, and would never have got well." Clara had in her turn become thoughtful. "But Heidi," she began again, "in that case we ought never to pray for anything, as God always intends something better for us than we know or wish for." "You must not think it is like that, Clara," replied Heidi eagerly. "We must go on praying for everything, so that God may know that we do not forget that it all comes from him. If we forget God, and he lets us go our way, and we get into trouble." "How did you learn all that?" asked Clara. "Grandmama explained it to me first of all, and then when it all happens, just as she said, I knew it myself. And I think, Clara," she went on as she sat up in bed, "we ought certainly to thank God tonight for that you can walk now, and that he has made us so happy." "Yes, Heidi, I'm sure you were right, and I'm glad you reminded me. I almost forgot my prayers for very joy." Both children said their prayers, and each thanked God in her own way for the blessings he had bestowed on Clara, who had for so long lain weak and ill. The next morning the grandfather suggested that they should now write to the grandmamma and ask her if she would not come and pay them a visit, as they had something new to show her. But the children had another plan in their heads, for they wanted to prepare a great surprise for grandmamma. Clara was first to have more practice in walking so that she might be able to go a little ways by herself. Above all things, grandmamma was not to have a hint of it. They asked the grandfather how long he thought this would take, and when he told them about a week or less, they immediately sat down and wrote a pressing invitation to grandmamma, asking her to come soon, but no word was said about there being anything new to see. The following day were some of the most joyous that Clara had spent on the mountain. She awoke each morning with a happy voice within her, crying, "I am well now, I am well now. I shan't have to go about in a chair. I can walk by myself like other people." Then came the walking, and every day she found it easier and was able to get a longer distance. The movement gave her such an appetite that the grandfather cut his bread and butter a little thicker each day, and was well pleased to see it disappear. He thought about the foaming milk in a larger jug, so he could fill the little bowls over and over again. And so another week went by, and the day came which was to bring grandmamma up the mountain for her second visit. Just taking a small break. I'm going to go ahead and take the book cover down. Chapter 23. Goodbye to the Beautiful Mountain. Grandmamma wrote the day before her arrival to let the children know that they might expect her without fail. Peter brought up the letter early the next morning. As he neared the group, his steps slackened, and the instant he had handed the letter to Uncle, he turned quickly away as if frightened to run off up the mountain. "Grandfather," said Heidi, who had been watching him with astonished eyes, "why does Peter always behave now like the Great Turk when he thinks somebody is after him with a stick? He turns and shakes his head and goes off with a bound just like that." "Perhaps Peter fancies he sees the stick which he so well deserves coming after him," answered Grandfather. Heidi set about tidying the hut, as Grandmamma must find everything clean and in good order when she arrived. Clara looked on amused and interested to watch the busy Heidi at her work. Then the children dressed up and went and sat together outside on the seat ready to receive her. At last they saw the procession winding up the mountain just in the order they had expected. First there was the guide, then the white horse with Grandmamma mounted upon it, and at last of all the porter with a heavy bundle on his back, for Grandmamma would not think of going up the mountain without a full supply of wraps and rugs. Nearer and nearer wound the procession. At last it reached the top, and Grandmamma was there looking down on the children from her horse. She no sooner saw them, however, sitting side by side, than she began quickly dismounting, as she cried out in a shocked tone of voice, "Why is this? Why are you not lying in your chair, Clara? What are you all thinking about?" But even before she had got close to them, she threw up her hands in astonishment, exclaiming further, "Is it really you, dear child? Why, your cheeks have grown quite round and rosy. I should hardly have known you again." And she was hastening forward to embrace her, when Heidi slipped down from the seat, and with Clara leaning on her shoulder, began walking along quite coolly and naturally. Then, indeed, Grandmamma was surprised, or rather alarmed, for she thought at first that it must be some unheard-of proceeding of Heidi's. But no, Clara was actually walking steadily and uprightly beside Heidi. Laughing and crying, she ran to them and embraced first Clara and then Heidi, and then Clara again, unable to speak for joy. All at once she caught sight of Uncle standing by the seat and looking on, smiling at the meeting. She went up to the old man and seized his hands. My dear uncle, how much we have to thank you for! It is all your doing. It is your care and nursing, and God's good sun and mountain air," he interrupted her, smiling. "Yes, and don't forget the beautiful milk I have," put in Clara. "Grandmamma, you can't think what a quantity of goat's milk I drink, and how nice it is." "I can see that by your cheeks, child," answered Grandmamma. I really should not have known you. You have grown quite strong and plump, and taller too. I never hoped or expected to see you look like that. I cannot take my eyes off you, for I can hardly yet believe it. But now I must telegraph without delay to my son in Paris and tell him he must come here at once. I shall not say why. It will be the greatest happiness he has ever known. My dear uncle, how can I send a telegram? Have you dismissed the man yet? They have gone, he answered, but if you are in a hurry, I will get Peter and he can take it for you. Grandmamma thanked him, for she was anxious that the good news should not be kept from her son a day longer than was possible. So Uncle went aside a little ways and blew such a resounding whistle through the fingers that he awoke a responsive echo among the rocks far above. He did not have to wait many minutes before Peter came running down in answer, for he knew the sound of Uncle's whistle. Peter looked as white as a ghost, for he thought Uncle was sending for him to give him up. But instead, he only gave him a written paragraph with paper with instructions to take it down at once to the post office at Dorothy. Uncle would settle for the payments later, as it was not safe to give Peter too much to look after. Peter went on with the paper in his hand, feeling some relief of mind for the present. For as Uncle had not whistled for him in order to give him up, it was evident that no policeman had yet arrived. So now they all sat down in peace to their dinner around the table in front of the hut, and Grandmamma was given a detailed account of all that had taken place, how Grandfather had made Clara try first to stand and then to move her feet a little every day, and how they had settled for the day's excursion up the mountain and the chair had been blown away, how Clara's desire to see the flowers had induced her to take the first walk, and so by degrees one thing had led to another. The recital took some time, for Grandmamma continually interrupted with fresh exclamations of surprise and thankfulness. It hardly seems possible. I can scarcely believe it is not all a dream. Are we really awake, and are we all sitting here by the mountain hut? And is that round-faced, healthy-looking child my poor little white, sickly Clara? And Clara and Heidi could not get over their delight at having the success of the surprise they had so carefully arranged for Grandmamma, and at the latter's continued astonishment. Meanwhile, Mr. Sesamon, who had finished his business in Paris, had also been preparing a surprise. Without saying a word to his mother, he got into the train one sunny morning and traveled that day to Basle. The next morning he continued his journey, and for a great longing had seized him to see his little daughter, from whom he had been separated the whole summer. He arrived at Ragatz a few hours after his mother had left. When he heard that she had that very day started for the mountain, he immediately hired a carriage and drove as far as Dorfli, and then started to climb the mountain. He went on, but still no hut came in sight, and yet he knew there was one where Peter lived halfway up, for the path had been described to him over and over again. He began to wonder if he was on the right path, and whether the hut lay perhaps on the other side of the mountain. He looked round to see if any one was in the sight of whom he could ask the way, but far and wide there was not a soul to be seen, nor a sound to be heard. Only at moments the mountain wind whistled through the air, and the insects hummed in the sunshine, or a happy bird sang out from the branches of a solitary large tree. Mr. Sesamon stood still for a while to let the cool alpine air blow in his hot face. But now someone came running down the mountainside. It was Peter with a telegram in his hand. He ran straight down the steep slope, not following the path on which Mr. Sesamon was standing. As soon as the latter caught sight of him, he beckoned for him to come. Peter advanced towards him slowly and timidly, with a sort of sidelong movement, as if he could only move one leg properly and had to drag the other after him. "Hurry up, lad," he called, and when Peter was nearer enough, "Tell me," he said, "is this the way to the hut where the old man and the child Heidi live, and where the visitors from Frankfurt are staying?" A low sound of fear was the only answer he received as Peter turned to run away in such precipitous haste that he fell head over heels several times and went rolling and bumping down the slope in involuntary bounds, just as the same way as the chair, only that Peter fortunately did not fall to pieces that one had done. Only the telegram came to grief, and that was torn into fragments and flew away. How extraordinarily timid these mountain dwellers are, thought Mr. Sesamon to himself, for he quite believed that it was the sight of a stranger that had made him such an impression on this unsophisticated child of the mountains. After watching Peter's violent descent towards the valleys for a few minutes, he continued his journey. Peter, meanwhile, with all his efforts, could not stop himself, but went rolling on and still tumbling head over heels at intervals in a most remarkable manner. But this was not the most terrible part of his sufferings at that moment, for far worse was the fear and horror that possessed him, feeling sure as he did now that the policeman had really come over for him from Frankfurt. He had no doubt at all that the stranger who had asked him the way was the very man himself. Just as he had rolled to the edge of the last high slope above Dorfli, he was caught in a bush, and at last able to keep himself from falling any farther. He lay still for a second or two to recover himself and to think over matters. "Well done, another one you have come bumping along like this," said a voice close to Peter. "And which of you tomorrow is the wind going to send rolling down like a badly sown sack of potatoes?" It was the baker, who stood there laughing. He had been strolling up... hang on a second. He had been strolling out to refresh himself after his hot day's work, and had watched with amusement as he saw Peter come rolling over and over in such much the same way as the chair. Peter was on his feet in a moment. He had received a fresh shock. Without once looking behind him, he had begun hurrying up the slope again. He would have liked best to go home and creep into bed, so as to hide himself, for he felt safest when there. But he had left the goats up above, and Uncle had given him strict injunctions to make haste back so that they might not be left too long alone. And he stood more in awe of Uncle than any one, and would not have dared to disobey him on any account. There was no help for it. He had to go back, and Peter went on groaning and limping. He could run no more, for the anguish of mind he had been through, and the bumping and shaking he had received were beginning to tell upon him. And so with lagging steps and groans he slowly made his way up the mountain. Shortly after meeting Peter, Mr. Sesamon passed the first hut, and so was satisfied that he was going the right way. He continued his climb up with renewed courage, and at last, after a long and exhausting walk, he came in sight of his goal. There, only a little distance farther up, stood the grandfather's home, with the dark tops of the fir trees waving above its roof. Mr. Sesamon was delighted to have come to the last steep bit of his journey. In another minute or two, he would be with his little daughter, and he pleased himself with the thought of her surprise. But the company above had seen his approaching figure and recognized who it was, and they were prepared for something he little expected as a surprise on their own part. As he stepped onto the space in front of the hut, two figures came towards him. One, a tall girl with fair hair and pink cheeks, leaning on Heidi, whose dark eyes were dancing with joy. Mr. Sesamon suddenly stopped, staring at the two children, and all at once the tears started to his eyes. What memories arose in his heart! Just so had Clara's mother looked, the fair-haired girl with the delicate pink and white complexion. He did not know if he was awake or dreaming. "Don't you know me, Papa?" called Clara to him, her face beaming with happiness. "Am I so altered since you saw me last?" Then the father ran to his child and clasped her in his arms. "Yes, you are indeed altered. How is it possible? Is it true what I see?" And the delighted man stepped back to look full at her again, and to make sure that the pictures would not vanish before his eyes. "Are you my little Clara? Really my little Clara?" he kept on saying. Then he clasped her in his arms again and again put her away from him, that he might look and make sure it was she who still stood before him. Then Grandmamma came up, anxious for a sight of her son's happy face. "Well, what do you say now, dear son?" she exclaimed. "You have given us a pleasant surprise, but it is nothing in comparison to what we have prepared for you, you must confess." And she gave her son an affectionate kiss as she spoke. "But now," she went on, "you must come and pay your respects to Uncle, who was our chief benefactor." "Yes, indeed, and our dear little Heidi, too," said Mr. Sesamon, shaking Heidi by the hand. "Well, you quite well and happy in your mountain home? But I need not ask, no alpine rose could look more blooming. I'm glad, child. It is a pleasure to me to see you so." And Heidi looked up with equal pleasure into his kind face. How good he had always been to her, and that he should find such happiness awaiting him up here on the mountain made her heart beat with gladness. Grandmamma introduced him to Uncle, and while the two men were shaking hands and Mr. Sesamon was expressing his heartfelt thanks and boundless astonishment to the old man, Grandmamma wandered round to the back to see the old fir trees again. Here another unexpected sight met her gaze, for there, under the trees, stood a great bush of the most wonderful dark blue gentians, as fresh and shining as if they were growing on the spot. "How exquisite! What a lovely sight!" she exclaimed. "Heidi, dearest child, come here. Is that you who have prepared this pleasure for me? It is perfectly wonderful." The children ran up. No, I did not put it there," said Heidi, "but I know who did." "They grow just like that on the mountain, Grandmamma. Only if anything, they look more beautiful still," Clara put in. "But guess who brought those down today?" And as she spoke, she gave such a pleased smile that the grandmother thought for a moment the child herself must have gathered them. But that was hardly possible. At this moment, a slight rustling was heard behind the fir trees. It was Peter, who had just arrived. He had made a long round, trying to slip by unobserved. But Grandmamma had seen and recognized him, and suddenly the thought struck her that it might be Peter who had brought the flowers, and that he was now trying to get away unseen, feeling shy about it. But she could not let him go off like that. He must have some little reward. "Come along, boy, come here, do not be afraid," she called to him. Peter stood still, petrified with fear. After all he had gone through that day, he felt he had no longer any power of resistance left. All he could think was, "It's all up with me now." Every hair on his head stood on end, and he stepped forth from behind the fir trees, his face pale. "Courage, boy," said the Grandmamma in her effort to dispel his shyness. "Tell me how straight out, without hesitation, was it you who did it?" Peter did not lift his eyes, and therefore did not see at what Grandmamma was pointing. But he knew that Uncle was standing at the corner of the hut, fixing him with his gray eyes, while beside him stood the most terrible person that Peter could conceive, the police constable from Frankfurt. Quaking in every limb, and with trembling lips, he muttered a low, "Yes." "Well, and what is there dreadful about that?" said Grandmamma. Because it is all broken to pieces, and no one can put it together again." Peter brought out his words with difficulty, and his knees knocked together so that he could hardly stand. Grandmamma went up to Uncle. "Is that poor boy a little out of his mind?" she asked sympathetically. "Not in the least," Uncle assured her. "It is only that he was the wind that sent the chair rolling down the slope, and he is expecting his well-deserved punishment." Grandmamma found this hard to believe, for in her opinion Peter did not look an entirely bad boy, nor could he have had any reason for destroying such a necessary thing as the chair. But Uncle had only given expression to the suspicion that he had had from the moment the accident happened. The angry looks which Peter had from the beginning cast at Clara, and the other signs of his dislike to what had been taking place on the mountain, had not escaped Uncle's eyes. Putting two and two together, he had come to the right conclusion as to the cause of the disaster, and he therefore spoke without hesitation when he accused Peter. The lady broke out into lively expostulations on hearing this. "No, no, dear uncle, we will not punish the poor boy any further. One must be fair to him. Here are all these strangers from Frankfurt who come and carry away Heidi, his one sole possession, and a possession well worth having too, and he is left to sit alone all day after day for weeks, with nothing to brood over his wrongs. No, no, let us be fair to him. His anger got the upper hand and drove him to an act of revenge. Foolish one, I own, but when we all behave foolishly when we are angry." And saying this, she went back to Peter, who still stood frightened and trembling. She sat down on the seat under the fir trees and called him to her kindly. "Come here, boy, and stand in front of me, for I have something to say to you. Leave off shaking and trembling, for I want you to listen to me. You sent the chair rolling down the mountain so that it was broken to pieces. That was a very wrong thing to do, as you yourself knew very well at the time, and you also knew that you deserved to be punished for it. But be sure of this, Peter, that those who do wrong make a mistake when they think no one knows anything about it. For God sees and hears everything, and when the wicked doer tries to hide what he has done, then God wakes up a little watchman that he places inside of all of us when we are born, and who sleeps on quietly till we do something wrong. And the little watchman has a small goad in his hand, and when he wakes up, he keeps on pricking us with it, so that we have not a moment's peace. And the watchman torments us still further, for he keeps on calling out, 'Now you will be found out. Now they will drag you off to punishment.' And so we pass our lives in fear and trouble, never know a moment's happiness or peace. Have you not felt something like that lately, Peter?" Peter gave a contrite nod of the head, as one who knew all about it, for Grandmamma had described his own feelings exactly. "And you calculated wrongly also in another way," continued Grandmamma, "for you see the harm you intended has turned out for the best for those who you wished to hurt, as Clara had no chair to go up in, and yet wanted so much to see the flowers she made the effort to walk, and every day since she has been walking better and better. Do not forget my words, and whenever you feel inclined to do anything wrong, think of the little watchman inside you with his goad and his disagreeable voice. Will you remember all that?" "Yes, I will," answered Peter, still very subdued, for he did not yet know how the matter was going to end, as the police constable was still standing with the uncle. "That's right, and now the thing is over and done for," said Grandmamma. "But I should like you to have something for a pleasant reminder of the visitor from Frankfurt. Can you tell me anything that you have wished very much to have? What would you like best as a present?" Peter lifted his head as this and stared open-eyed at Grandmamma. Up to the last minute he had been expecting something dreadful to happen, and now he might have anything that he wanted. His mind seemed all of a whirl. "I mean what I say," went Grandmamma. "You shall choose what you would like to have as a remembrance from the Frankfurt visitors, and as a token that they will not think any more of the wrong thing you did. Now do you understand me, boy?" The fact began at last to dawn upon Peter's mind that he had no further punishment to fear, and that the kind lady sitting in front of him had delivered him from the police constable. He suddenly felt as if the weight of a mountain had fallen off him. He had also by this time awakened to the further conviction that it was better to make a full confession at once of anything he had done wrong or had left undone, and so he said, "And I lost the paper too." Grandmamma had to consider a moment what he meant, but soon recalled his connection with her telegram and answered kindly, "You are a good boy to tell me. Never conceal anything you have done wrong, and then all will come right again. And now, what would you like me to give you?" Peter grew almost giddy with the thought that he could have anything in the world that he wished for, He had the vision of the yearly fair at Mayenfeld with the glittering booths and all the lovely things that he had stood gazing at for hours without a hope of ever possessing one of them, for Peter's purse never held more than 5 cents, and all these fascinating objects cost double that amount. There were the pretty little red whistles that he could use to call his goats, and the splendid knives with rounded handles known as toad strikers, with which one could do such things as whittling. Peter remained pondering. He was trying to think which of these two desirable objects he should best like to have, and he found it difficult to decide. Then a bright thought occurred to him. He would then be able to think over the matter between now and the next year's fair. "A dime," answered Peter, who was no longer in doubt. Grandmamma could not help laughing. "That is not an extravagant request. Come here, then." And she pulled out her purse and put four bright silver dollars in his hand, and then laid some dimes on the top of them. "We will settle our accounts at once," she continued, "and I will explain them to you. I have given you as many dimes as there are weeks in the year, and so every Sunday throughout the year you can take out a dime to spend." "As long as I live?" said Peter quite innocently. Grandmamma laughed more still at this, and the men, hearing her, paused in their talks to listen to what was going on. "Yes, boy, you shall have it all your life. I will put it down in my will. Do you hear, my son? And you are to put it down in yours as well, a dime a week to Peter as long as he lives." Mr. Sesamon nodded his assent and joined in the laughter. Peter looked again at the present in his hand to make sure he was not dreaming. Then he said, "Thank God!" And he went off running and leaping with more even than his usual agility, and this time managed to keep his feet, for it was not fear, but joy, such as he had never known before in his life, that now sent him flying up the mountain. All trouble and trembling had disappeared, and he was to have a dime every week for life. Later, after dinner, when the party was sitting together chatting, Clara drew her father a little aside and said with an eagerness that had been unknown to the little tired invalid, "Oh, Papa, if you only knew all that Grandfather had done for me from day to day. I cannot reckon his kindness, but I shall never forget them as long as I live. And as I keep on thinking of what I could do for him, or what present I could give him that would give him half as much pleasure as he has given me." "That is just what I wish most myself, Clara," replied her father, whose face grew happier each time he looked at his little daughter. "I've also been thinking about how we can best show our gratitude to our good benefactor." Mr. Sesamon went over to Uncle, and taking him by the hand, said, "Dear friend, you will believe me when I tell you that I have known no real happiness for years past. What good were money and property to me when they were unable to make my poor child well and happy? With the help of God you have made her whole and strong, and you have given new life, not only to her but to me. Tell me more, in what way can I show my gratitude to you? I can never repay all you have done, but whatever it is in my power to do is at your service. Speak, friend, and tell me what I can do." Uncle had listened to him quietly, with a smile of pleasure on his face as he looked at the happy father. "Mr. Sesamon," he replied in his dignified way, "I too have my share in the joy of your daughter's recovery, and my trouble is well repaid by it. I thank you heartily for all you have said, but I have need of nothing. I have enough for myself and the child as long as I live. Of course I am growing old, and I shall not be here much longer. I have nothing to leave the child when I die. If you could promise me that Heidi will never have to earn her living among strangers, then you would richly reward me for all I have done for your child." "There can never be any question of such a thing as that, my dear friend," said Mr. Sesamon quickly. "I look upon the child as my own. Ask my mother, my daughter, you may be sure that they will never allow the child to be left in anyone else's care. But if it will make you happier, I give you here my hand upon it. I promise you, Heidi shall never have to go and earn her living among strangers. I will make provisions against this both during my life and after. But now I have something else to say. Independent for her circumstances, the child is totally unfitted to live a life away from home. We found that out when she was with us. But she has made friends, and among them I know one who is at this moment in Frankfurt. He is winding up his affairs there, that he may be free to go where he likes and take his rest. I am speaking of my friend the doctor, who came here in the autumn, and who, having well considered your advice, intends to settle in this neighborhood, for he has never felt so well and happy anywhere in his company of you and Heidi. So you see, the child will henceforth have two protectors near her, and may they both live long to share the task. God grant indeed it may be so, added Grandmama, shaking Uncle's hand warmly as she spoke, to show how sincerely she echoed her son's wish. Then, putting her arm around Heidi, who was standing near, she drew the child to her. And I have a question to ask you too, dear Heidi. Tell me if there is anything you particularly wish for. Yes, there is, answered Heidi promptly, looking up delightedly at Grandmama. Then tell me at once, dear, what is it? I want to have the bed I slept in at Frankfurt with the high pillows and thick coverlid, and then Grandmother will not have to lie with her head downhill and hardly able to breathe, and she will be warm enough under the coverlid not to have to wear her shawl in bed to prevent her freezing to death. In her eagerness to obtain what she had set her heart upon, Heidi hardly gave herself time to get out all she had to say, and did not pause for breath until she had reached the end of her sentence. "Dearest child," answered Grandmama, moved by Heidi's speech, "what is this you tell me of Grandmother? You are right to remind me. In the midst of our own happiness we forget too often that which we ought to remember before all things. When God has shown us some special mercy, we should think at once of those who are denied so many things. I will telegraph to Frankfurt at once. Miss Rottermeier shall pack up the bed this very day, and it will be here in 2 days' time. God willing, Grandmother shall be sleeping comfortably upon it." Heidi skipped round Grandmama in her glee, and then, stopping all of a sudden, said quickly, "I must make haste down and tell her." No, Heidi. No, Heidi, what can you be thinking of?" said her grandfather reprovingly. "You can't be running backwards and forwards like that when you have visitors." But Grandmama interfered on Heidi's behalf. "The child is not so far wrong, Uncle," she said, "and poor Grandmother has too long been deprived of Heidi for our sake. Let us all go down to her together. I believe my horse is waiting for me, and I can ride down from there, and as soon as I get to Dorfli, the message shall be sent off. What do you think of my plan, son?" Mr. Sesamon had not yet had time to speak of his traveling plans, so he begged his mother to wait a few moments that he might tell her what he proposed doing. Mr. Sesamon had been arranging that he and his mother should make a little tour in Switzerland, first ascertaining if Clara was in a state fit to go some part of the way with them. But now he would have the full enjoyment of his daughter's company, and that being so, he did not want to miss any one of those beautiful days of the late summer, but to start at once on the journey that he now looked forward to with such additional pleasure. And so he proposed that they should spend the night in Dorfli, and that next day he should come and get Clara, and they would all three go down to Ragatz and make that their starting point. Clara was rather upset at first at the thought of saying goodbye like this to the mountains. She could not help being pleased, however, at the prospect of another journey, and no time was allowed her to give way to lamentation. Grandmama had already taken Heidi by the hand, preparatory to leading the way, when she suddenly turned. "But what is to become of Clara?" she asked, remembering all at once that the child could not yet take so long a walk. She gave a nod of satisfaction as she saw that Uncle had already taken Clara up in his arms and was following her with sturdy strides. Mr. Sesamon brought up the rear, and so they all started down the mountain. Heidi kept jumping for joy as she and Mrs. Sesamon walked along side by side. The grandmama asked all about Peter's grandmother, how she lived and what she did, especially in the winter when it was so cold. And Heidi gave her a minute account of everything, for she knew all that went on at grandmother's, and told her how the old woman sat crouching in her corner and trembling with cold. She was able also to give her exact particulars of what grandmother had and had not to eat. Grandmama listened with interest and sympathy until they came to grandmother's. Brigitte was just hanging out Peter's second shirt in the sun so that he might have it ready to put on when he had worn the other long enough. As soon as she saw the company approaching, she rushed indoors. "The whole party of them are just going past, Mother, evidently all returning home again," she informed the old woman. "Uncle is with them, carrying the sick child." "Lad, it is really to be so, then," sighed the grandmother. "And you saw Heidi with them? Then they are taking her away. If only she could come and put her hand in mine again. If I could but hear her voice once more." At this moment the door flew open, and Heidi sprang across the corner and threw her arms around grandmother. Grandmother, my bed is to be sent from Frankfurt with all the 3 pillows and the thick coverlid. Grandmama says it will be here in 2 days." Heidi could not get her words quickly enough, for she was impatient, smiled, but said a little sadly, "She must indeed be a good, kind lady, and I thought to be glad to think she was taking you with her, but I shall not outlive it long enough." "What is this I hear? And who has been telling my good grandmother such tales?" exclaimed a kindly voice, and grandmother felt her hand taken and warmly pressed, for grandmama had followed Heidi in, and heard all that was said. No, there is no thought of such a thing. Heidi is going to stay with you and make you happy. We want to see her again, but we shall come to her. We hope to pay a visit to the Alm every year, for we have good cause to offer up a special thanks to God upon this spot, where so great a miracle has been wrought upon our child." Then grandmother's face was lighted up with genuine happiness, and she pressed Mrs. Sesamon's hand over and over again, unable to speak her thanks, while 2 large tears of joy rolled down her aged cheeks. And Heidi saw that the glad exchange came over grandmother's face, and she too now was entirely happy. She clung to the old woman, saying, "Hasn't it all come about, grandmother, just like the hymn I read to you last time? Isn't that bed from Frankfurt sent to make you well?" "Yes, Heidi, and many, many other good things too, which God has sent me," said the grandmother, deeply moved. "I did not think it possible that there were so many kind people ready to trouble themselves about a poor old woman, and to do so much for her. Nothing strengthens our belief in a kind Heavenly Father who never forgets even the least of his creatures, so much as to know that there are such people full of goodness and pity for a poor useless creature such as I am." "Oh, my good grandmother," said Mrs. Sesamon, interrupting her, "we are all equally poor and helpless in the eyes of God, and all have equal need that he should not forget us. But now we must say good-bye, but only till we meet again, for when we pay our next year's visit to the Alm, you will be the first person we shall come and see. Meanwhile, we shall not forget you." And Mrs. Sesamon took grandmother's hand again and shook it in farewell. But grandmother could not let her off even then without more words of gratitude, and without calling down on her benefactress and all belonging to her every blessing that God had to bestow. At last Mr. Sesamon and his mother were able to continue their journey downwards, while Uncle carried Clara back home with Heidi beside him, so full of joy of what was coming for grandmother that every step was a jump. But there were many tears shed the following morning by the departing Clara, who wept to say goodbye to the beautiful mountain home where she had been happier than ever before in her life. Heidi did her best to comfort her. "Summer will be here again in no time," she said, "and then you will come again, and it will be nicer still, for you will be able to walk about from the very beginning. We can then go out every day with the goats up to where the flowers grow, and enjoy ourselves from the moment you arrive." Mr. Sesamon had come as arranged to take his little daughter away, and was just now standing talking with Uncle, for they had much to say to one another. Clara felt somewhat consoled by Heidi's words, and wiped away her tears. "Be sure you say good-bye to me, for me to Peter and the goats, and especially to Little Swan. I wish I could give Little Swan a present, for she has helped so much to make me strong." "Well, you can if you like," replied Heidi. "Send her a little salt. You know how she likes to lick some out of Grandfather's hand when she comes home at night." Clara was delighted at this. "Oh, then I shall send 100 pounds of salt from Frankfurt, for I want her to have something as a remembrance of me." Mr. Sesamon now beckoned to the children as it was time to be off. Grandmamma's white horse had been brought up for Clara, as she was no longer obliged to be carried in a chair. Heidi ran to the far edge of the slope and continued to wave her hand to Clara until the last glimpse of horse and rider had disappeared. And now the bed has arrived, and Grandmother is sleeping so soundly all night that she is sure to grow stronger. Grandmamma Sesamon, moreover, has not forgotten how cold the winter is on the mountain. She has sent a large parcel of warm clothing of every description, so that the blind grandmother can wrap herself round and round, and will certainly not tremble with cold now as she sits in her corner. There is a great deal of building going on at Dorfley. The father has arrived, and for the present is occupying his old quarters. His friends have addressed him to buy the old house that Uncle and Heidi lived in during the winter. The doctor is having his part of the old house rebuilt for himself, the other part being repaired for Uncle and Heidi, for the doctor is aware that Uncle is a man of independent spirit, who likes to have a house to himself. Quite at the back of the warm and well-walled stall is being put up for the 2 goats, and there they will pass their winter in comfort. The 2 men are becoming better friends every day, and as they walk about the new buildings to see how they are getting on, their thoughts continually turn to Heidi, for the chief pleasure to each is connected with the house, and that they will have the light-hearted little child with them there. "Dear friend," said the doctor on one of these occasions as they were standing together, "you will see this matter in the same light as I do, I am sure. I share your happiness in the child as if, next to you, I was the one to whom she most closely belonged, but I wish also to share all responsibilities concerning her, and to do my best for the child. I shall then feel I have my rights to her, and shall look forward to her being with me and caring for me in my old age, which is the one great wish of my heart. She will have the same claims upon me as if she were my own child, and I shall provide her as such, for her as such, and so she will be able to live, and so we will be able to leave here without anxiety when the day comes when you and I must go." Uncle did not speak, but he clasped the doctor's hand in his, and his good friend could read in the old man's eyes how greatly moved he was, and how glad and grateful he felt. Heidi and Peter were at this moment sitting with Grandmother, and the one had so much to relate and the others to listen, that they all 3 got closer and closer to one another, hardly able to breathe in their eagerness not to miss a word. And how much there was to tell of all the events that had taken place that last summer, for they had not had many opportunities of meeting since then. And it was difficult to say which of the 3 looked the happiest at being together again, and at the recollection of all the wonderful things that had happened. Mother Brigitte's face was perhaps the happiest of all, as now, with the help of Heidi's explanation, she was able to understand, for the first time, the history of Peter's weekly dime for life. Then at last the grandmother spoke. "Heidi, read me one of my hymns. I feel I can do nothing for the remainder of my life but thank the Father in heaven of all the mercies he has shown us." And that is the end of Heidi. I have my next book coming in from the library tomorrow, actually, and it is another one of my favorites. It's going to be The Boxcar Children. I'm hoping to do a little bit of art for it. But in the meantime, I'm going to end the stream here and then come back in a couple of minutes after a short break and do a game stream. And I hope you'll hang around with me for that. Anyways, thanks for listening. Bye.